The iceberg chart is a way to classify information ranging from well-known to obscure. The deeper you dive into the iceberg's depths, the more bizarre and uncanny do its entries get. This iceberg contains a total of 92 entries, ranging from the most commonplace progressive rock knowledge available at the top to some truly weird and unheard of entries at the bottom that even die-hard prog fans probably wouldn't know. This iceberg chart is inspired by an iceberg made by user r/ElectricLazarus over on Reddit with several modifications and additions made by me. But anyways, the script for this video is already 55 pages long, and the video length likely projects this, so without any further ado, greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog, and let's get into explaining the progressive rock iceberg. In the Court of the Crimson King. In the Court of the Crimson King is widely regarded across the board as the first ever progressive rock album. Released on October 10th, 1969, this debut album by prog legends King Crimson marks an album that is fully progressive from start to finish. And while up until that point there were hints and glimmers of prog music with bands such as the Moody Blues, Colosseum, and even Pink Floyd to name a few, In the Court of the Crimson King is seen as the starting pistol for all prog to come in the years afterwards. The Dark Side of the Moon. Staying on the topic of influential prog albums, Pink Floyd's 1973 The Dark Side of the Moon is commonly considered to be the most popular and best-selling prog album of all time, reported to have sold roughly 45 million copies since its release, which actually puts it at the fourth most selling album of all time out of any musical genre. As is to be expected with the meteoric success of Pink Floyd's seminal album, there are those in the prog circles who deem this album not worthy of the prog title, though I tend to disagree, and I think that this just goes to show that progressive rock has the potential to resonate with far more people than it usually gets credit for today. Close to the Edge. While The Dark Side of the Moon is globally regarded as the best prog album in existence, the more devout prog community seems to have chosen Yes's 1972 Close to the Edge as the best prog album ever created. Out of the measly 3 songs that adorn this album's track listing, the one which harkens most with prog lovers is the eponymous Close to the Edge track that covers the entirety of side 1 of the album. This piece is the epitome of prog music, and the charm of its 18 minutes and 41 seconds has been attempted to be recreated, replicated, and rematched, but was never done so to the same extent as the original. Noteworthy enough is also the album's cover art, which is surprisingly barren and simplistic when compared to Yes's catalog, which further makes this album stick out of the rest and become so memorable within generations of new listeners. Prog classics from non-prog artists. Being a music genre, the allure of progressive rock has grasped many non-prog solo artists and bands. Many in turn dabbled in creating prog epics during their careers, and some even managed to outperform the rest of their hits with the uncanny prog song. I'm talking about the likes of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, Dire Straits' Telegraph Road, Billy Joel's Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, and perhaps more recently Lana Del Rey's Venice Bitch. There are of course many more to fall under this category, so feel free to share your favorites in the comments. Supergroups. The term supergroup refers to a musical group or band that formed of members who have already proved their musical wits and talents in a solo career or as a part of another band. And while not being limited to prog rock at all, the practice of forming supergroups was used as a part of the genre's ambitious nature that always strives to challenge musical complexity and intricacy by manners of virtuosity and technical abilities. In short, the supergroup is a band created intentionally for commercial success. The proto-progressive band Cream is regarded by some to be the first ever supergroup, and its success paved the way to the formation of prog supergroups like the Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Matching Mole, Refugee, National Health, UK, Asia, Liquid Tension Experiment, Transatlantic, The Tangent, and many more. Syd Barrett. Roger Keith Barrett, better known as Syd Barrett, was the co-founder of Pink Floyd. Barrett was an aspiring musician from a fairly young age, and he would create music on his own or as a part of a band known as the Mottos, before their eventual disbanding in 1962. In his teens, Barrett's musical style would be influenced by the likes of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bo Diddley, while at the same time he would meet two of his future bandmates in Pink Floyd, Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Barrett co-founded the band that would later become Pink Floyd in 1965, and after starting to experiment with LSD in the same year, Barrett's style would lean heavily into psychedelia, which would ultimately create the whimsically psychedelic sound that characterizes the Floyd's debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. However, Sid's abuse of mind-altering substances would lead him to become a dysfunctioning burden on the popularizing band, and on April 6, 1968, Barrett would officially be replaced by David Gilmour as lead guitarist and writer. The remainder of Sid's musical career and personal life are less glamorous as they were set to be at the start, and decades after his departure from the band, Pink Floyd would never forget Sid's contributions, and his memory would be remembered in Pink Floyd songs, concerts, and interviews. Pink Floyd's post-Syd Barrett album, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, is actually a tribute to Syd himself, and it is said that during the recording, Syd Barrett in the flesh walked into the studio, and the band members simply did not know what to do with that fact. And also, as a side note, this apparently happened on David Gilmour's wedding day, which just makes the story all the more weird. But ultimately, Syd Barrett would pass away from pancreatic cancer on July 7th, 2006, leaving behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. The Alan Parsons Project Chicago Bulls theme. In May 1982, the Alan Parsons Project released their sixth studio album titled Eye in the Sky, and while the eponymous track was released as a single and saw major success in the US and beyond, its precursor on the album, Sirius, found major recognition from a far unlikelier source. As legend has it, in 1984, while waiting for a movie to start playing at the cinema, Tommy Davis, who was then the announcer for the Chicago Bulls basketball team, heard Sirius being played in the theater and had a eureka moment. A day later, Davis went and bought a copy of Eye in the Sky and started practicing the Bulls' entrance to the court, accompanied by the harsh synthesizer sounds of Sirius, a practice which would become a staple of Chicago Bulls and the wider basketball major league world to come. The Dark Side of Oz. The Dark Side of Oz, the Dark Side of the Rainbow, or the Wizard of Pink Floyd are all colloquial names for the same weird phenomenon, which describes the inexplicable synchronicity between the visuals of the 1939 film classic The Wizard of Oz and the soundscapes of Pink Floyd's 1973 The Dark Side of the Moon. No one knows exactly who came up with this brilliant connection, but it is rumored to have started in an online Pink Floyd news group in the mid-90s, where members discussed how beginning to play the album as the MGM lion roars in the opening credits resulted in a surprisingly synchronous viewing experience. These online rumors were then picked up by one Charles Savage, a reporter for the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, who published an article about this coincidental phenomena on August 1st, 1995. From this point onwards, the urban legend became widely known and explored, and with the advent of YouTube becoming the mainstay video sharing platform online, pairings of the film and the album started showing up as far back as in 2007, though it seems that the few uploads from that year and onwards had their sound completely removed, likely due to copyright infringement. The oldest video featuring the whole album and film side by side was in fact uploaded in 2015, and seems to have appeased the copyright gods by not being taken down or muted in all of these years. Additionally, using filtered search on YouTube, I was able to track down the oldest existing YouTube video to reference this phenomenon, and it's not what you'd expect. It's a comedy skit of sorts that's a part of a show called The Happy Show, and the video is of two characters, Anson and Paco, played by the same guy, basically doing a React-style video to The Dark Side of Oz, but in a classic early internet fashion, we don't actually see or hear what they're reacting to, thus this video was never stricken down by copyright. And as for the traits of this unique phenomenon, there are notable synchronicity parts, such as how Claire Torrey's wailing vocals on The Great Gig in the Sky match with the tornado scene at the start of the film, or basically the entirety of Money perfectly aligning with Dorothy entering Oz, and the classic end of album Heartbeat just as Dorothy is listening to Tin Man's non-existent heart. Needless to say, if you haven't experienced this uncanny combination yet, I highly urge you to do so. The Canterbury Scene. So I actually made a Canterbury Scene in 60 seconds video, and you can check it out right here. But here we go again. The Canterbury Scene is a name for a specific subset of progressive rock, hailing from the town of Canterbury, Kent, which resides in England. The start of the distinct Canterbury sound can be traced back to a band called the Wildflowers, which played a unique blend of pop, R&B, and had an increasing interest in jazz. While not being progressive in of themselves, past members from the Wildflowers would go on to form the Soft Machine and Caravan, which are the seminal Canterbury Scene bands that set the standards for the unique sound that would be associated with the region for decades to come. This is a sound engrossed with masterful keyboard playing, tight jazz-like rhythms, and a fair tinge of good old British whimsy. Krautrock. Krautrock is much of what the Canterbury Scene simply isn't, yet they are both equally progressive. The term Krautrock was popularized by British music journalists who encapsulated the German essence of the music by mishmashing the famous German dish the sauerkraut and the rock music into one umbrella label. As you might already guess, Krautrock sprouted as a musical genre in West Germany during the 1960s and 70s, and was influenced a lot by the likes of psychedelic rock, avant-garde, and electronic music. Krautrock was also partially created due to young musicians wishing to distance themselves from the legacy of World War II's Germany and find influence in the American rock genre, which they took their own spin on and eventually created a distinct musical genre that persists until today. Krautrock today is best remembered for contributions of bands such as Amondel II, Tangerine Dream, Kraftwerk, Neu, Can, Ashra Temple, Faust, and many more. Rock Progressivo Italiano. Rock Progressivo Italiano, translated to Italian Progressive Rock and otherwise known simply as RPI, is a subdivision of progressive rock that specifically highlights the genre's development in Italy during the late 1960s and going into the 1970s. And while more prog music originated from Italy in the decades after, the RPI scene was best captured in the bustling early 70s. There are many reasons for the pinpointed distinction of RPI from the rest of progressive rock, and a lot of it has to do with the rise in human rights, the furthering of people from the church, and the left-leaning views of the younger generations. This all culminated in a bunch of talented young individuals who saw uncanny success with their music, which was highly inspired by classical music and mimicked the cultural renaissance boom that characterized Italy's history. Inspired and often aided by already successful British prog artists and bands like PFM, Banco del Mutuo Soccorso, Le Ormi, and Area were able to prepare their musical careers to great heights, and to be remembered for their continuous challenging of musical boundaries and leaving us with an impressive catalog of some of the finest prog rock music out there. The Prog Archives. www.progarchives.com is the domain of an online website existing since 2002 and who's still active and flourishing today. The website was created by avid prog enjoyers who wished to document all of past and present prog music and create a bustling online community where people can share their thoughts and insights about progressive rock. While the website's raiment remains true to the old school early 2000s HTML look, the site is still constantly updating with old unearthed albums and new releases on a daily basis. The Prog Archives currently boasts the biggest collection of data concerning prog rock music, and their mission is venerable, so if you enjoy using this site, consider donating a small fee for its long-term activity. Gentle Giant samples in hip-hop. The terms hip-hop and progressive rock do not usually coincide together in the musical realm, yet for one band in particular, it seems that prominent hip-hop artists cannot get enough of them. I am of course talking about the quirky phenomenon of Gentle Giant being sampled many times by hip-hop artists. It seems as if something about Gentle Giant's uncanny, jazz whimsical, perhaps slightly baroque instrumentation really goes a long way in adding some unique flavors to hip-hop tracks. tracks. And I do have to show an appreciation for the art of sampling here, because from all that I've heard, these bits from Gentle Giant are put to highly creative uses that are transformative in their nature. Officially on Spotify, the Gentle Giant band account even went as far as to create a playlist with all the Gentle Giant sampling songs, and some prominent artists found on there are the likes of Travis Scott, Madvillain, Madlib, and others.
My ways are strange.
Wreak havoc, beatless, mad traffic, sleek and lavish, people speaking, leaking to the maverick.
A car crash is no equivalent. We far from innocent, crossing the family and we is ignorant, acting belligerent.
Miles Davis Electric Period. Miles Davis was never the capital P type of prog person, but he did come close to it at one point. Davis released his first album, appropriately titled First Miles, all the way back in 1945, where he would show promising signs of a young jazz trumpeter. Miles never really ceased to create music though. By the mid-late 1960s, he did become less motivated to create as he once used to, and as the story goes, after a while of creative drought, Miles decides to try again. He picks up the trumpet's mouthpiece and blows into it to get rid of the grime and dried spit, and the sound that resonates from it inspires him. This is what he has been looking for. From that point around 1968 and onwards, Miles channeled the new energy into his music, and all of a sudden fans saw Davis go on stage surrounded by not his usual jazz quintet, but by a myriad of electric guitars and reverb pedals, ready to create a new form of jazz, the electric kind. In this time, Miles Davis created some beloved albums, especially in the prog sphere, such as 1969's In a Silent Way, and 1970's Bitches Brew, and also 1975's live album Agartha, to name a few. Coheed and Cambria is a concept band. The American prog band Coheed and Cambria formed back in 1995 and was originally called Shabooty, meaning naked prey. Shabooty spent their first years in experimenting with musical styles and finding what felt right for them, and in the meantime they composed songs and took rough conceptual inspirations from guitarist Claudio Sanchez's comic fiction story The Bag Online Adventures. When in 1998 drummer Nate Kelly left the band, the name was changed to Coheed and Cambria, inspired by the names of Sanchez's story's two main characters, and the name The Bag Online Adventures was also promptly changed to The Amory Wars. This has all laid the groundwork for a unique concept-driven band that resembles what Magma were doing in their heyday. There is of course much more to dive into with a full Coheed and Cambria extended lore here, but that is a topic for a whole other video, and I'm sure that there are many diehard fans who understand this stuff way better than I do, so you can go and fill in the rest on your own. Supertramp 9/11 Conspiracy. Ah yes, the Supertramp 9/11 conspiracy theory. In the year 1979, Supertramp released their sixth studio album, Breakfast in America, and since the horrific terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, people have begun to speculate on Supertramp predicting the disaster 3 decades prior. This mostly relates to the imagery on the album's cover, which shows a view seen from inside an airplane of the Manhattan skyline, where the buildings are substituted for tabletop cups, plates, shakers, and cutlery. Eerily enough, the two twin towers can be seen obstructing the letters U and P on the band's name, which, if viewed through a mirror, spells out the numbers 9/11. Additionally, the waitress on the cover is supposed to substitute the famous Statue of Liberty, and continuing that same logic, her cup of OJ marks the burning torch, which is conveniently located just over the two towers. And lastly, when looking at the back cover, the band can be seen enjoying their morning breakfast while reading the news, a scenario which many Americans were likely engaged in on the morning of September 11th when the first plane hit the towers at 8:45 a.m. To be continued meme. Perhaps to lighten up the mood a little, here's a weird story of how Roundabout by Yes found a new and rather unexpected audience in the early to mid 2010s. In order to understand this meme, we have to look at the timeline. On November 12, 1971, Yes releases their fourth studio album, Fragile, in the UK. The opener track for the album is called Roundabout, and while it's a banger, it goes on for 8.5 minutes, which is too long for radio. So on January 1972, alongside the album's release in the US, Yes released the edited down single version of Roundabout for the world to hear, which becomes widely popular. Jumping much ahead to August 10, 1987, when a Japanese illustrator and writer by the name of Hirohiko Araki releases what would become the first chapter of a long-running manga series called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It is now October 8, 1990, and Araki releases chapters 163 to 167, where at the end of the final chapter, one can spot an arrow with the writing inside of it that reads "to be continued," inciting the readers for what's to come next in the series. This to be continued arrow trope became a staple of the series, and when the manga was eventually adapted into a TV anime series and started airing on October 6, 2012, the episodes would end on a climactic cliffhanger with the iconic to be continued arrow accompanied by no other than Steve Howe's guitar intro to Roundabout, of all songs. Roundabout was then used as the outro song for the entirety of the first season, before being substituted in season 2, likely due to copyright, but the impact was made. Anime lovers from across the world were exposed to Yes and their mastery. By April of 2013, there was a new all-time popular application in the App Store called Vine, which popularized short-form media by small individual creators online. And in 2016, a new trend became rapidly successful on the platform, and that is of course the to be continued meme, where people would pair the iconic arrow and music to a video with a climactic twist and pause just before the action so as to create anticipation and a comedic punch. And speaking of a comedic punch, why do I hear this music? Klaatu are the Beatles. After the sweepingly beloved Liverpoolian Beatles broke up in 1970, their fans could only hope for a reunion and reformation of the band. And as the years went by, this prospect seemed less and less likely to occur. Yet, in 1976, some unexpected event marked a change in this course of history, when a music journalist for the Providence Journal by the name of Steve Smith discovered an inconspicuous album titled 347 EST by an unknown band named Klaatu. When giving it a spin on his turntable, Smith immediately noted how the album's drumming, vocals, and writing style sounded much like that of the Beatles, and with that in mind, Smith wrote an article for the journal and pitched it to the editor, who approved of its publishing. In the article, Smith made the hinting claim that he might have discovered the Beatles as they were formed under the pseudonym of Klaatu, and released an album under everyone's noses. The notion was further strengthened by the album's lack of personnel credit, crediting the music only to the band's name, Klaatu. Suddenly, 347 EST went from being a hidden gem to becoming a top-performing album on the charts, peaking at a substantial 32nd spot. And as the conspiracy was running rampant among fans, a man by the name of Dwight Douglas decided to ruin everyone's fun and went to the US Copyright Office and uncovered the names behind the Klaatu name, only to quickly realize that these were no Beatles, but rather a Canadian trio of highly skilled studio musicians who simply wanted their music to be judged on the merit of its sound. And while their expectation took a rather unexpected turn, Klaatu is now remembered as a unique semi-progressive band with a cult following to go alongside it. Prog artists on David Bowie songs. On his own, David Bowie was never quite a progressive rock artist, but throughout his 5-decade-long career, he was able to branch out into many progressive and experimental regions, and he often collaborated with notable prog artists and featured them on his albums. I believe that this entry refers to the following examples: Rick Wakeman playing on 1969's Space Oddity, as well as on Hunky Dory and the Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Brian Eno can be found on 1977's Low, Heroes, Lodger, and Outside. Robert Fripp also made an appearance on Low, as well as on 1980's Scary Monsters. Adrian Belew can also be found playing the mandolin and guitar on 1979's Lodger. And to complete the King Crimson set, bassist Tony Levine played with Bowie on both 2002's Heathen and 2013's The Next Day. And lastly, Dream Theater's Jordan Rudess also played keyboards on Bowie's Heathen album. Dream Theater's Metropolis 1 was a joke. Pretty much what the title says. During the making of Dream Theater's 1992 album Images and Words, the band composed a track called Crumbling Metropolis, though they later omitted the word crumbling and added the part 1 to the title as a joke. Well, upon release of the song as a cassette single and later as a part of the album, the song became a live hit for the band, and fans kept demanding a continuation for the seemingly unresolved first part. Initially, the band reciprocated and wrote a 20-minute long second part epic named Metropolis Part 2, and as fate would have it, the piece stretched out to a full-length album, detailing one of progressive rock's most captivating stories and marking the album as a hallmark of modern conceptual prog. This all does lead me to ponder what might have been had no one ever suggested the jokingly Part 1 addition to the original song. Would we still have the magnificent Metropolis Part 2 album today had it not been for one lousy joke? I guess we'll just never know. Robert Fripp is aware of r/King Crimson circle jerk. As it stands, there is only one single evidence that I am aware of to show that King Crimson guitarist and founder Robert Fripp is aware of the existence of the King Crimson Circle Jerk subreddit, and that's an incongruous Reddit account that goes by the name Robert Fripp _. The account was created sometime in 2023, seemingly only to respond to a post where a Reddit user was asking about gaining access to the lost tapes of the Devil's Triangle. Then the Robert Fripp account responded to the post with the following message. Hello sir, sorry, I will not let you access these tapes. If you contact me privately, arrangements can be made to give you copies of certain tapes. Sincerely, Robert Fripp. This last part would become a staple of every comment that this user has made from that point onwards, always ending his messages with "Sincerely, Robert Fripp." And around the beginning of 2024, this persona would take it up a notch by posting an AMA, which is Ask Me Anything thread on the King Crimson Circle Jerk subreddit, where the Robert Fripp _ user outright claimed to be the real Robert Fripp and that he was answering questions from other users. And by the looks of it, some of these answers seem quite legit, while others seem sketchy to say the least. But the real Robert Fripp is known to be somewhat sketchy and edgy, so it is really hard to tell if this whole deal is real or just a big bluff. Steven Wilson remixes. Stephen John Wilson was born on November 3, 1967, just on the cusp of the progressive rock high time, yet his influence on the prog world would be dictated in later decades to come. Wilson is today known as one of the most influential persons to ever grace the prog scene for two main reasons. Firstly, his own musical endeavors that include, but are not limited to, his band Porcupine Tree, projects such as No Man, Base Communion, and Storm Corrosion, and to top it all off with a marvelous solo career. Though secondly, Wilson never forgot his own roots and influences, and being a prog artist who was directly inspired by the prog legends of former years, Wilson paid his homage to many albums by providing his own remixes to them. As of the making of this video, Steven Wilson has remixed 74 individual albums, including most of the King Crimson and Jethro Tull discographies, the Golden Years albums of Yes, and others such as XTC, Tangerine Dream, Marillion, Gentle Giant, ELP, Caravan, and more. Roger Waters' spitting incident. So if you are like me, you probably know of this story, but perhaps not too much of the why of this uniquely bizarre story in Pink Floyd's legacy. But to recap, this event took place on the Floyd's American tour after releasing their 10th studio album Animals at the start of 1977. It was the evening on July 6, 1977, and the band were performing at the Stade du Parc Olympique venue in Montreal, Canada. The opener for the night was Sheep from the band's most recent album, and the crowd was loving every moment of it. and at the start of that night it seemed that the band were also enjoying themselves quite a bit, though things would start to turn sour with a distinctly ruckus combination of a fair few drunken teens and some smuggled fireworks and firecrackers. That night, Roger Waters made 3 unsuccessful attempts trying his best to start singing the quiet and personal lines of Pigs on a Wing Part 2, which were all rudely interrupted by fireworks being set off in the crowd. He actually remarked to the audience the following: "Oh, for fuck's sake, stop letting off fireworks and shouting and screaming, I'm trying to sing the song." And he followed that with, "I mean, don't you care if you don't want to hear it? You know, fuck you. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who do want to hear it." Waters did finally manage to complete the song, and the band promptly moved on to playing Pigs 3 different ones, which is when the incident presumably happened. Seeing as there were already much pent-up angers in the audience and the band, it only really took a spark, pun intended, to escalate things further. And that's exactly what happened when Roger spat on one of the front rowers with distinct distaste, as can be seen from a video captured in that fateful night. Waters, although, was immediately regretful and apologetic for his actions, and the band did make it up to the shocked audience by playing the unplanned Us and Them in the encore, which is ironically symbolic of the event that just transpired. And this whole incident would further Rogers' disdain for the audience and the relationship between the band and their fans, which would become the prime motif of their theatrical wall building practice in their live touring of The Wall a couple of years later. Edge Bumyasi's recording sessions were continuously interrupted and delayed by Damo Suzuki and Irvin Schmidt playing chess too much. This is exactly what it sounds like. When recording their 3rd studio album, Edge Bumyasi, in 1972, Can's keyboardist Irvin Schmidt and their vocalist Damo Suzuki became infatuated with playing chess during studio time. Consequently, the making of the album was delayed by these games, and in a recent 2019 interview, Suzuki claimed that he had won most games by simply improvising and not thinking too much ahead. Whether Schmidt would agree with this statement or not, the truth of the matter is that the Okra album was made partially in lieu of time that could have been spent playing chess. Maynard James Keenan's stage presence. This entry could refer to several things, and I will try and go over all of them here. But first, Maynard James Keenan is best known as the writer and frontman singer of the American progressive metal band Tool, and while he seems to be a relatively normal guy on a day-to-day basis, his onstage presence can get pretty overwhelmingly memorable at times. Keenan is known to have donned many costumes on stage, and these played a major role in his show theatrics. With his lead band Tool, Keenan established the mohawk, the kabuki mask, the variety of bras and tights, and he once even painted his whole body blue. Seeing as Keenan is glamorously bald while playing with his other band, A Perfect Circle, he would don an assortment of long-haired wigs as well. Though on the more animated side, Maynard James Keenan was known to go completely berserk on stage sometimes, moving and contorting his body to the heavy music in a seemingly deranged and uncanny manner. Although nowadays Keenan's stage presence is faced with much confusion from the audience because he has begun singing from the back of the stage, particularly obscuring his presence especially behind the behemoth that is Danny Carey's drum kit. And to this strange behavior, Keenan responded with saying that he stays at the back of the stage in order to better stay in cue with the rest of the band, and that facing the audience from the front of the stage disables his ability to adjust himself with the rest of the players. Keith Emerson's death. Keith Noel Emerson was born on November 2, 1944, in Todmorden, Yorkshire, in the United Kingdom. Emerson was taught the piano by his father, who was an amateur pianist, and in later years Emerson would receive formal piano teachings, mainly in classical pieces. In 1967, Keith Emerson would co-found an influential proto-progressive band called The Nice, which would be his musical leaping point and where he acquired the name for himself as a rising talent in the world of rock keyboard players. And when The Nice split in 1970, Emerson established Emerson, Lake and Palmer with ex-King Crimson bassist and vocalist Greg Lake and ex-Atomic Rooster drummer Carl Palmer. Keith Emerson's career with ELP and Alone would always be hailed for his masterful control of any keyboard, whether acoustic, analog, or electronic, and his playing style had always been sophisticated and virtuously unmatched. But with the arrival of old age, Keith's body began to betray him, specifically with the muscles in his right arm and hand, which were affected by neurological damage. And so, a few months before his expected tour in Japan, Keith Emerson took his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head on March 10th, 2016, presumably fearing the prospect of disappointing his audience with poor skills, and probably more so, disappointing himself in his inevitable deterioration. Keith Emerson is now remembered as one of progressive rock's all-time legendary players, and his subtle, concerned, and perfectionist soul is what ultimately led to his untimely demise. Porcupine Tree started as a joke. As noted here before, Steven Wilson, the frontman and spiritual inspirer of Porcupine Tree, was heavily influenced by 70s prog legends, specifically with Pink Floyd and their psychedelic and progressive traits. So, alongside his friend Malcolm Stokes, the two created a fictitious band, Porcupine Tree, as a hoax in 1987. At the beginning, they played it off as if the band was a legendary 70s prog band, and even constructed an entire backstory for its creation and discography. And in order to make this ruse more convincing, Wilson recorded several hours of music as evidence for the band existing. Evident by his devotion to his main musical project, No Men, Wilson never intended for Porcupine Tree to be anything more than just a joke. But in 1980, Wilson seriously considered some of his Porcupine Tree music as legitimately marketable, so he pitched several copies of an 80-minute long cassette titled Trackwind's Seaweed Farm to several musicians and critics, and in return he received some positive reviews and an offer to have Porcupine Tree featured on the newly made Delirium label. And by the time that The Sky Moves Sideways came out in 1995, the band was already put in full throttle and abandoned its cynical upbringing in favor of a promising artistic future. Rio. Rio, which stands for Rock in Opposition, is a divergent subgenre deriving from the avant-prog subgenre. The latter simply goes to describe progressive rock music that leans heavily towards the avant-garde. But what marks the difference between avant-prog and Rio has mostly to do with intent. The Rock in Opposition movement began in the late 60s and early 70s, coinciding with the creation of prog rock itself. The founders of the short-lived movement were Henry Cow, an avant-prog band hailing from Cambridge, England, and spiritually led by drummer Chris Cutler, who inserted themes of left-leaning political ideologies into the group's musical expression. And with their close connection with the emerging artist over the Canterbury scene, Henry Cow became an underground staple with a devout cult following. Yet, in order to expand the musical and ideological mission, Henry Cow helped elevate several other European bands to have shared their artistic expression and beliefs, and thus they created the quintinity of the 5 original Rio bands: England's Henry Cow, Belgium's Universe Zero, France's Etron Feu le Lion, Sweden's Sam la Mamas Mana, and Italy's Stormy Six, who all played together in the first ever Rock in Opposition festival held in London on March 12, 1978. But by the end of the 1970s, the movement quickly dissipated, though today many more artists are being labeled as Rio, as they reflect the same spirit of opposition through composition in their works. These include some beloved names such as Cardiacs, The Residents, This Heat, and others. Zool. It is said that if you give a cult enough time, it will become religion. That is, in premise, what Zool is. A cult-like idea that, through time, garnered enough acclaim and followers to grant its place as a subgenre of progressive rock, and as a type of unmatched musical expression. With that said, Zool is a term taken from Copaean, a conlang created by Christian Vander, which means celestial. Christian Vander on his part is a French drummer, composer and singer who formed the first ever Zool musical group Magma in 1969. At first, Magma were the pioneers of their own new type of music, inspired heavily by freeform jazz improv with explicit use of rhythm fractions through the disjointed and even sluggish bass and drum parts. This was all topped by the maniacal singing in the undecipherable Cobain language, which was sung by Vander in a high-pitched choir. If all of this sounds to you like a recipe for a one-off disaster, you would normally be right, but as I implied at the start, this anomalous music captivated many hearts in the thriving avant-garde scene, and thus Magma was allowed to keep producing music. And quickly enough, Magma's albums became loosely conceptual, telling stories of extraterrestrial races and time-traveling pharaohs, and soon enough, other musical groups enhanced the uniqueness of Magma's sound and joined the movement which received the moniker of Zool. And since their inception, Magma has been actively creating albums every few years and touring quite regularly with an alternating cast of musicians, and they are joined in the scene by other Zool greats such as the Italian Universal Totem Orchestra, the French Waydorge Eschaton and Shub Niggurath, and the Japanese Ruins Happy Family and Koenji Hayake. Pink Floyd original band names. The band that most of us know today as Pink Floyd did not begin as such, and while the official founding year of Pink Floyd is cited as 1967, earlier incarnations of the band with a rotating cast can be traced all the way back to 1963, with the formation of Sigma 6 Sextet, which by that point already featured Rick Wright and Nick Mason and Roger Waters playing together. Around 1964, Sigma 6 adopted several other names such as Megadeth's The Abdabs and later the Screaming Abdabs, Leonard Lodgers, and Spectrum 5, before settling on the name T-Set for a while in 1965. After Syd Barrett joined the band in 1965 as well, while waiting to go on stage for one of their gigs, he discovered that yet another band by the name of T-Set were about to perform there. So, in a spur-of-the-moment decision, Barrett came up with the name The Pink Floyd Sound, inspired by two blues musicians featured in Barrett's collection, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. The band then omitted the sound from their name and were known as the Pink Floyd until the release of their debut album in 1967, where they would ultimately brand themselves as Pink Floyd, the name which would remain unchanged for the rest of their musical longevity. Proto-prog bands. From the Greek word meaning the earliest, the term proto-prog emerged after the golden age of progressive rock, and was meant to describe artists, bands, albums, and songs with a distinct progressive tinge that were created before the prog boom, initiated of course by King Crimson's debut album in 1969. Under modern terms, some of the greatest rock bands to grace the 1960s can now be viewed as proto-progressive. These include The Who, Deep Purple, The Doors, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and of course the Beatles. Artists like Captain Beefheart and Frank Zappa were clearly creating some avant rock in 1967, and there are even some albums that stand to challenge the integrity of In the Court of the Crimson King as being the first ever prog album. I'm talking about the Moody Blues Days of Future Past, Iron Butterflies and Agata da Vida, Procol Haram's Shine On Brightly, Touch's self-titled singular album, and The Who's Tommy, as well as others. Yet, none seem to completely encapsulate the prog spirit, and thus they are all fondly celebrated under the category of proto-prog. The first sidelong epic. So I actually made a video about this topic here already. Nevertheless, while most people's answer to what constitutes the first ever prog album is pretty straightforward, the same thing cannot be said for the first ever rock sidelong epic. In my video about the topic, I was pretty adamant that when taking into account that a piece has to be progressive, coherent, and take up as much of the one side of the vinyl record as it can afford, the first prog epic ever is Atom Heart Mother Sweet by Pink Floyd. And while I and many others hold true to this sentiment, some have argued to various degrees of credibility that pieces such as the Beatles' Abbey Road Side B, Procol Haram's In El Twas an I, Colosseum's Valentine's Suite, and the aforementioned Agata da Vida by Iron Butterfly can all be worthy contenders for the title. And well, I can neither prove or disprove any of these claims, and I guess no one really can. Scott Walker Tilt, The Drift, Bish Bosh. This one's an interesting entry to the iceberg, seeing as Scott Walker is not quite progressive, yet his musical career could ironically be described as undergoing some pretty harsh progressivism. Scott Walker, born Noel Scott Angel, was a British-American singer-songwriter who found stardom in his early years with the establishment of the Walker Brothers, a trio consisting of John Mouse, Gary Leeds, and Scott Angel. At that time, Mouse owned a fake ID that allowed him to perform in venues despite being underage, and the ID was stamped with the name John Walker, which became Mouse's stage name. And with the formation of their band, the three adopted the Walker surname persona and acted as if they were a familial act. The Walker Brothers ended up disbanding in 1976, and Scott opted to keep the name Scott Walker, which he would be known by for the rest of his career. And from 1967 onwards, Walker made a name for himself as a teen pop icon, playing a unique type of Baroque pop. But with the release of his fourth album, Scott would morph his sound towards the art pop and avant-garde. Walker later took an 11-year hiatus between 1974 and 1984, released an album titled Climate of a Hunter, and then disappeared again for another 11 years before returning with the highly avant-garde industrial and orchestrally experimental Tilt album. This one was a far cry from the teen pop star of the mid-70s, yet many resonated with this deep sound, and after another customary 11-year hiatus, Walker came back with 2006's The Drift, and followed this with Bish Bosh in 2012. This 3-album run was referenced by Walker to be a trilogy of sorts, and while it is hard to pinpoint any direct continuation between the three that deal with the most unnerving and macabre topics, there certainly is a thematic and spiritual link that resonates across this epitomal triad. And lastly, as for why Scott Walker was put on this iceberg chart, well, it probably has to do much with him working and being inspired by the likes of Robert Fripp and Brian Eno, while also cited as being a direct influence on artists such as Steven Wilson and Mikael Åkerfeldt, who expressed their intrigue with Walker's sound on their joint album as Storm Corrosion. Canterbury Scene isn't Canterbury exclusive. As the name suggests, the Canterbury scene, while sprouting in a church town of Canterbury, Kent, played a major inspiration role for other artists outside of the UK entirely, and it itself was influenced by some external contributors, most notably being the Australian David Ellen, who later expanded upon the Canterbury scene with his band Gong Over in France. France also saw the pinpointed yet unforgotten contributions of Moving Gelatin Plates to the scene. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Super Sister made headlines with their uniquely Canterburyan sound, and the Italian Picchio del Pozzo and the Belgian Cos also made their mark on the scene and are still widely regarded as connoisseurs of the Canterbury scene, despite some never even visiting the location in their lifetimes. The Snow Goose is a soundtrack album. 1975's album The Snow Goose by Camel is a highly beloved prog album within progressive rock circles, and unlike the Camel albums to precede it, this one relied solely on instrumental music with absolutely no lyrics on it. The story of how The Snow Goose came to be relates directly to Camel's epitomal previous album Mirage, where the band experimented with creating a literary-inspired piece in the White Rider Suite, directly inspired by Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. So alas, the band decided that they would expand upon the idea and create an entire album based on the work of literature, and started working on a couple of compositions inspired by Hermann Hesse's 1922 novel Siddhartha, although the initial idea was quickly scrapped and substituted for Paul Gallico's 1940 novella The Snow Goose. Though, when approached by the band for receiving the rights to the name The Snow Goose, Gallico straight up rejected the request due to the band's branding being associated with Camel cigarettes. So, under legal obligations, the album's name was dubbed Music Inspired by The Snow Goose, and that remained its name until 2013, when the album was re-recorded and the copyright name was lifted, for it had been 73 years since it was coined, and the album could finally be officially named simply as The Snow Goose. But as for the entry itself, it refers to the album not only being music inspired by the short novella, but also as a good soundtrack for its listening experience. For if you are like most of society and have an average reading speed of about 200 to 250 words per minute, chances are that if you began reading the book as the first note of the record plays, your experience of words and music would meld into one, with the pieces lining up fairly accurately between book and album. Though the band never seemed to address this unique quality of the album, and I'm skeptical that they were even aware of it, but as far as I'm concerned, this can also be viewed as a cool coincidence, the likes of the Wizard of Oz movie and Dark Side of the Moon album working in surprisingly perfect harmony. The Shags. The story of The Shags is, in my opinion, one of rock's greatest campfire short stories, which never fails to capture an intrigue of music lovers. Sometime in the 1940s, a then child by the name of Austin Wiggins Jr. received a palm reading from his mother, and in that reading it was predicted that Wiggins would marry a strawberry blonde woman, have 2 sons after his mother's passing, and that his daughters would form a very successful band. Well, as it happened, the first 2 predictions happened to come true, so Wiggins, now an adult, withdrew his 4 daughters from school, bought them instruments, paid for their musical and vocal lessons, and formed the band The Shags, a name inspired by the shag hairstyle at the time and the 1959 film The Shaggy Dog. This is probably the point where I should tell you that the Wiggins daughters were not interested in becoming musicians, but their stubborn and often temperamental father disallowed them to choose any other adolescent path. So the Shags played and never seemed to get any better, and their lousy musicianship was a point of ridicule and mock when they got back to school, and especially when they played their mandatory weekly town hall gigs, arranged of course by their father. The 3 older sisters, Dorothy, Betty, and Helen, were mainly involved with the Shags, while their younger sister Rachel only made the occasional appearance on the bass guitar. And in 1969, Austin Wiggins Jr. declared that the Shags were ready to record an album. From his daughters to the studio workers, no one seemed to agree with Wiggins' awful idea, but he was too stubborn to have his mind changed. So in the course of one fateful day in 1969, the Shags recorded an entire studio album titled Philosophy of the World. It is said that during the recording, the studio staff could be seen rolling on the floor with laughter, though one engineer also described the girls as looking miserable during the entire recording session. The resulting album is primarily why the Shags are featured in this video. You see, the band's lack of any musical skill and competence led to the creation of a very sporadic, erratic, disjointed, and almost avant-garde sound, which would somehow make it unintentionally progressive in spirit. Though the story somehow only gets weirder from this point onwards. Apparently 1,000 copies were originally pressed of the album, but only about 100 were delivered and 900 others disappeared. Also, when at the age of 28, the oldest sister Helen married in secret, and her father then chased her with a shotgun because he did not approve of that. In 1975, the Shags went again into studio by their father's command, and they were somehow even more miserable than last time. And finally, in that same year, Austin Wiggins Jr. died of a heart attack, which prompted the disbanding of the Shags. As the daughters married and moved out, their house was sold by their mother, though the new tenants came to believe that the place was haunted by Austin's soul, and thus the house was given to the local fire department to be burnt down for practice. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, because somehow Austin's mother's prophecy did come true in full after all those years, and the Shags became a cult classic band, with artists such as Frank Zappa and Kurt Cobain hailing them for being some of the most creative, superior artists ever. And, well, yeah, I did say this was a weird and wild campfire story. Jaco Pastorius' death. John Francis Pastorius III, otherwise known as Jaco Pastorius, was born on December 1st, 1951. In his early teen years, Pastorius actually played the drums, but after a wrist injury at the age of 13, he had to abandon the instrument. and after saving up for a couple of years, Pastorius bought his own upright bass at the age of 17, though the Florida humidity caused the instrument to crack, so Pastorius traded it for a 1962 Fender Jazz bass. As Jaco was preparing to record his debut album, he attended a concert by the jazz fusion band Weather Report in Miami. And after that show, he went up to the band's keyboardist Joe Zawinul and exclaimed that he was the greatest bass player in the world, which prompted Zawinul to ask him for a demo tape of Pastorius playing, which he would receive and be impressed by. And when Weather Report bassist Alphonso Johnson left the band in late 1975, Jaco Pastorius was invited to join their ranks, which he did. And Pastorius' tenure with Weather Report was indeed a successful one, and his performance on albums such as Black Market and Heavy Weather are all-time fusion classics, though by 1982 Jaco started abusing drugs and alcohol, and following disagreements with the band's career direction, he would promptly leave Weather Report for good. Pastorius then assembled the Word of Mouth Big Band, though their concerts performed poorly, and Jaco was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the same time. And finally, on September 11, 1978, Jaco Pastorius would be ejected out of concert premises in Sunrise Musical Festival in Florida. Pastorius would try to kick in again through the venue's glass door, which ultimately left Jaco with multiple facial fractures, an arm and eye injuries, which put him in a coma. And while recovery seemed promising for a while, a brain hemorrhage led to Jaco Pastorius passing away on September 21, 1978, at the age of 35. Robert Wyatt's accident. Robert Wyatt is a prolific musician hailing from the Canterbury scene. In fact, he was a major part of its emergence from the beginning, with him helping the Soft Machine after the breaking up of the Wildflowers. And in spite of his particularly young age at the time, Wyatt made waves with his drumming abilities and allowed for the Soft Machine to become a Canterbury and later UK staple of a band. In the early 1970s, alongside his career with the Soft Machine, Wyatt also worked on improving himself as a well-rounded writer and vocalist, and began working on his solo work, especially with the advent of rising tensions amidst his own band. Wyatt would indeed end up leaving the Soft Machine in August of '71, and he would go on to form Matching Mole, which itself was a sarcastic spin on the name Soft Machine, which in French is pronounced as Machine Molle. And with Matching Mole, Wyatt made 2 classic Canterbury albums, before promptly disintegrating the band in late 1972, though the story of Matching Mole was not over in Wyatt's eyes, and he worked the following year looking to assemble a new lineup for the band and start recording material for a 3rd album. Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason, who was a longtime friend of Wyatt at the time, was actually contacted by Wyatt about joining the band in this new incarnation. It is said that Nick received 2 notes one after the other, the first asking him to produce Matching Mole's 3rd album, and the second letting him know that Wyatt fell through the 4th story window the previous night. Confused? Well, Nick Mason probably was as well. You see, all of the plans that Wyatt had as a drummer and a songwriter were suddenly put on hold for this tragic event. Much like the other stories on this iceberg, Robert Wyatt also had a drinking problem, and while attending a party hosted by his landlady on June 1st, 1973, Wyatt would get more inebriated than he was even comfortable with. And wouldn't you know it, Wyatt found himself on the 4th floor balcony and then outside of it, hurling towards the ground below. The next thing Robert recalled about this incident is that he remembered waking up in the hospital bed, and he would later assume that he intentionally took that absurdly moronic leap of faith, though the alcohol kept that part pretty hazy for him. From that point onwards, Wyatt would become a paraplegic, losing all functions in the lower half of his body. There is, however, a good ending to this story. Once Wyatt was able to get out of his hospital bed and into a wheelchair, he found an old piano in the premises and began rehearsing his prior materials, which would sow the seeds for an even more awe-inspiring musical career to come. And while Wyatt's music pre-accident and post-accident is marginally different, both sides encapsulate a charm that is etched into the DNA of the Canterbury sound until today. Thick as a Brick is a joke. Jethro Tull's 1972's Thick as a Brick honestly needs no introduction, seeing as it is one of the most beloved prog albums to ever grace the scene, yet its coming into being story is giggle-worthy and might as well be shared here. So when Jethro Tull released their sensational Aqualung album in 1971, critics were quick to praise it and give their own armchair analysis of its themes, and one claim that circulated more than others was that critics called Aqualung a concept album, which Jethro Tull frontman Ian Anderson absolutely despised. While the album did have several leading motives strewn across its 11 tracks, the album itself was just a loose compilation of materials that Tull were interested in making at that time, which brings us back to Thick as a Brick, which was made to poke intentional fun at the critics and the fans, where the band embraced the Pythonian humor style to satirize the idea of concept albums and even progressive rock itself, for all its unique traits and quirks. And the resulting album, with only one title song to its name, made for a prime example of how progressive rock and conceptual albums should be made, and despite its nonsensical lyrics and subtle humor, Thick as a Brick now resides comfortably as Jethro Tull's most acclaimed prog album. Tim Smith's death. Timothy Charles Smith was born on July 3, 1961. In his childhood, Smith became proficient at playing the guitar and was also well acquainted with the bass and keyboards, and after forming an unnamed band in 1975, Smith would go on to found a band called Filth in 1977. Filth in turn would sometimes be misremembered as Pilaf, Filth and the Filth, but none of that mattered when around 1979 the band's name was changed to Cardiac Arrest, and in the following year the band released their first album called The Obvious Identity, which was distributed on a measly 1,000 cassette tapes on the band's live shows. In 1981, Smith decided to change the band's name simply to be Cardiacs, and their first album under that moniker, Toy World, was released in that same year. Finally, in 1984, Smith erected his own label called the Alphabet Business Concern, or ABC for short, and Cardiacs even supported Marillion on their tour, gaining them notoriety in the process. Smith's tenure with Cardiacs was a successful one, and the band managed to further many preconceptions of the avant-punk and experimental rock world and make a historical name for themselves. Unfortunately, while attending a gig of My Bloody Valentine in 2008, Smith suffered a heart attack caused by a stroke. While in the hospital, Smith sustained another stroke, which this time led to hypoxia that caused irreversible brain damage. This was paired with Smith's being diagnosed with a rare condition called dystonia, which culminated in him losing most voluntary control over his body and being subjected to involuntary muscle contractions and paralysis. In the following decade, several fundraising concerts and campaigns were held to help Smith's treatment and hopeful recovery, and in 2018, Tim Smith received the honorary degree of Doctor of Music, which he definitely deserved, from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. But alas, Smith's life would come to an end when he suffered another heart attack on the evening of July 21, 2020, making him 59 at the time of his death. Pink Floyd Christmas and Moon Landing songs. So it's Christmas season 1969. Syd Barrett has officially parted ways with Pink Floyd, and the band have just dropped their fourth album, Ummagumma, about a month prior. This is when the BBC approached Pink Floyd with an offer to play a special Christmas song live on air, which the band agreed to. Now, when I say the band, I am actually referring to a specific unheard duo of Nick Mason and Richard Wright. Well, you might think to yourself, a Christmas tune with Nick on the drum set and Richard on the keys and vocals doesn't sound all that bad. But here's the kicker. The song actually sees Wright playing an odd mix of classic Christmas chords interlaced with jazzy embellishment, while Mason is actually half-assing a bunch of lyrics that almost sound to be improvised, while the two can of course hardly contain their joking attitudes and snarky remarks throughout the whole ordeal. This recording, while being meant for a one-time bit on the BBC radio, managed to be preserved and can now be found under the name of Merry Christmas Song by Pink Floyd, which captures the band's early whimsy glory in full view. And as for the Moon Landing song, this one is slightly more serious and can also be found with a simple YouTube search. The story goes that on July 20th, 1969, just a few months away from the Christmas recording, the BBC were getting ready to commence with the first ever overnight broadcast in order to capture the entirety of the Apollo 11 moon landing mission. This unique broadcasting task did stress some officials on the BBC, who feared of empty spaces in their schedule. So in an interesting decision, the BBC called in Pink Floyd to provide improvised jams to parts of the first lunar mission. And so it was that on 8:17 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time Zone, Pink Floyd was jamming along to the unbelievable sights of the first man to lay foot on the lunar surface. And this recording was kept well and made its way onto the web, and it was additionally officially released as a part of the Early Years box set in 2016. And for your timely pleasure, I have taken it upon myself to pair the music of the Apollo 11 landing with that of the immersive Pink Floyd. So enjoy.
How is the quality of the TV?
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on them.
The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway lost media. What can I say? This might be prog's greatest tragedy of all time. When Genesis dropped their sixth studio album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, an album tour was inevitable, and the band had big plans for the theatrics of their live shows, pairing them masterfully with the convoluted narrative of the album and exhibiting the story through the use of a 3-panel display, as well as a myriad of costumes worn by Peter Gabriel during the 1.5-hour long show. With all of its theatrical mastery, Gabriel wanted the show to be professionally recorded in full, but kept postponing actually doing so, until when in the middle of touring, Gabriel announced his departure from the band. This conglomeration somehow resulted in only a few snippets of video being captured from over 100 shows that the band played of the album, and while it has been rumored that a German crew was invited to film the whole ordeal, these clips were never released to the public, nor was their existence incontrovertibly proven, making the 1974-1975 live shows of The Lamb officially classified as a bizarre case of progressive rock lost media. Dream Theater, Ass and Balls. As someone who isn't a major Dream Theater fan, I never thought about the band inserting all too many hidden Easter eggs and jokes into their music, but I guess I was wrong about that because this entry is a real doozy of hidden gems and good-natured humor. So this entry probably refers to this clip right here, taken from the band performing live in Chile in 2005. And this bit might seem a little bit out of the blue for most people, and that's because it is. This also casually delivered line is not a part of the song's lyrics, but it is nonetheless a reference to another song by Dream Theater, that one being In the Name of God from the band's 2003 album Train of Thought. If you listen carefully during the bit from 5 minutes and 51 seconds to 6 minutes and 7 seconds, you can hear a repeating Morse code playing in the background. This, when translated back to English, spells, you guessed it, eat my ass and balls. And this decision to sing it live on show is a mere continuation of the band's good-natured humor during their live shows in the previous years, like doing a cover of Wipeout and the infamous Canadian rap, and even this bit is taken from the same Chilean show in 2005, which shows the following. James LaBrie Shrimp Incident. This incident would later be described by James LaBrie as his life's darkest moment. This story happened about 2 years after Dream Theater released their impressively successful album Images and Words in 1992. On December 10th, 1994, as Dream Theater vocalist James LaBrie was vacationing in Cuba with his wife and several friends, they all came down with a severely nasty case of food poisoning caused by consuming contaminated shrimp. I don't want to get too graphic with this one, but Labrie later noted that this incident hurt his vocal cords substantially, and after hitting rock bottom during this whole ordeal, a doctor instructed Labrie that he should take 6 months off from singing and even talking if he could help it. This was a major blow to Labrie, who was supposed to perform a mere 10 days later with Dream Theater's Asian and European legs of their tour. So instead of complying with the doctor's advice, Labrie did the tour and tried his best not to strain his vocal cords, which ultimately made his recovery span to several years, until he could finally get back to his performance skills pre-Shrimp incident. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard Game Boy game. On November 17, 2017, Australian microtonal psych rock band King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard released their 12th and most progressive album to date, Polygon Wonderland. And this release was surprisingly special because the band explicitly stated that the album was entirely free, and that Polygon Wonderland did not belong to the band, rather it belonged to the fans. And with that statement, all copyright concerns that naturally accompany most albums were stripped away, leaving this album to be printed, pressed, altered, and even video gamed at one point. Personally, in my ventures, I managed to trace 2 bootlegs made in direct inspiration of this album. The first is a Nintendo NES that transformed the original recording into an 8-bit version that accompanies the game. And secondly, as the title of this entry suggests, there was also a bootleg Game Boy cartridge made inspired by Polygon Wonderland. There are no recordings online of this game being played in action, and all we have to go on is the case design of the cartridge, which is a direct parody of the similarly titled Super Mario Land Game Boy original. Additionally, this fan project does seem to be the culminative effort of Bop_World, who made the cartridge design, Mushtoom, who did the sound design for the game, and Gizmo, who coded the game's hardware. Frank Zappa Sleeping in a Jar commercial. Uncle Meat is the name of the 6th studio album released by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention in April of 1969. In this double album, one can find a track called Sleeping in a Jar, which is one of those brilliant ahead of its time tunes that Zappa concocted way back in the mid to late 60s. And 2 years later, Zappa's work and philosophy would be captured on Swedish TV with a show called Spotlight that incorporated interviews of Zappa, clips from his live shows, and some unique intermissions. One of those intermissions happened to be a feature of a short animatic for the Mother Sleeping in a Jar song. The visuals are very much suggestive, and the use of the song is done in an advertising context. Though being Zappa-esque, the visuals are colorful, confusing, and uncontrovertibly suggestive. I will try and show some of it here, though YouTube censorship can only get me so far with this one. And one other note, if you are prone to epileptic seizures, you might want to shut your eyes for about 10 seconds.
Mom and Dad are sleeping in a jar.
ELP's second gig. Emerson, Lake and Palmer's start was not a humble beginning by any stretch of the imagination. Being a supergroup, the band were expected to excel in compositional creativity and in delivering memorable live shows. Yet for their first live show as a trio, a small venue in Plymouth on the outskirts of London was chosen so that if the show went to shits, word would not get around too hastily. But as luck and mostly skill would have it, the band performed well and the show received a strong positive response. So just 6 days later, on August 29, 1970, the band were flown to perform in the Isle of Wight Festival, featuring great names such as Jethro Tull, Chicago, The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Donovan, Leonard Cohen, and more. And that is not to mention the roughly 600,000 people in attendance. And in this case, already being experienced performance came with its perks, and the newly founded ELP wowed the audience with a couple of songs such as The Barbarian and Take a Pebble that would officially release on the band's debut album later that same year. And ELP also delighted the audience with a half-completed reimagining of Mussorgsky, Pictures at an Exhibition, that would see the light of day as a live album in 1971. King Crimson opened for Tool. On August 3, 2001, prog veterans King Crimson and prog metal contemporaries Tool were set to begin a set of 9 shows where Crimson would open for Tool, as the latter recently banged out their release Lateralus. This debut of the two prog giants together was set to happen in Red Rocks, Denver, and continue to venues in Seattle, Portland, Berkeley, and more. And while this entry might sound decent enough, it seems that testimonies of people back in the day, most average Tool fans that came to attend these shows, were not all too impressed with Crimson's stage presence, especially because most of the materials played were the bits and pieces that would conglomerate into King Crimson's 13th and final studio album, The Power to Believe. While the crowd was mostly indifferent to Crimson's distinct style, one commenter on Reddit recalls being in one of these shows and seeing the audience mercilessly booing the band, and only stopping when Maynard James Keenan went on stage and threatened to cancel the show if people don't shut up. Faip de Oyad original radio call sample. While Tool's Lateralus album is remembered for tracks such as Schism, Parable, and the title track, there is one song on the album that people always seem to gloss over, perhaps even with some degree of disdain. This song is Faip de Oyad, which translates to meaning Voice of God in a half-invented, half-discovered language by Edward Kelly in the 16th century. I am personally a big fan of this song, and I sometimes find myself listening to the entirety of Lateralus just for this closing piece, but under most people's categories this song is a terrifying menace. You see, Faip de Oyad is in fact sung, or rather spoken, or even acted, by Maynard James Keenan, but its lyrics were not written by him, or any member of Tool for that matter. The speech found on this song is a word-for-word reenactment of a phone call that took place in a 1997 radio show called Coast to Coast AM, which often took in anonymous phone calls from listeners who wanted to share their 2 cents about a variety of conspiracy theories and the paranormal. And one night, an anonymous caller, later dubbed the Frantic Man, came on the line, audibly distressed, and claimed that he was an ex-Area 51 employee currently on the run, and that he was making this call before they could triangulate his location. The caller stayed mostly elusive about his identity and whereabouts, but he did deliver a monologue that will be remembered for long after, and ultimately inspired the creation of Faip de Oyad. In his rant, Frantic Man claimed that aliens exist and that they have infiltrated aspects of our lives, including the military, and that great disaster is at bay and that many will die and the rest controlled. Suddenly, at the middle of the unnerving recollection, the radio broadcast suddenly cut off, leaving listeners on the literal edge of their seats. But when the show eventually came back, the caller was gone and the story was left unresolved. Though despite the accurate description of the event, the original call seems to have been considered lost for quite some time, though nowadays it can be found in full on YouTube with all its eerie glory. Tales from Topographic Ocean master tapes almost run over. After about 3 months of recording and post-production mastering, Yes frontman John Anderson and producer Eddie Alford left Morgan Studios in London with the newly completed master tapes of their upcoming album Tales from Topographic Oceans. When arriving at the car, the two struggled finding their car keys, which promptly led them to place the precious master tapes on the car roof. When they did eventually find the keys, the two got into the vehicle and completely forgot the tapes in their perilous placement. The tapes then fell onto a bus lane on the road, and John Anderson later claimed that he had to get out of the car and stand in front of a bus that was about to run over the master tapes, an event which could have scrapped the entire album altogether and perhaps result in a marginally different future for Yes as a band. Journey started out as a prog band. Journey is a behemoth of a band, defining the late 70s and especially 80s with their innovative arena rock style that wooed audience mostly around continental America. But the group's roots were far less contemporary in nature, as their initial 3-album run is much more akin to jazz fusion and progressive rock than their later works. It seems as if Journey was initially created to be a prog band, but in retrospect their formation was timed poorly, as by the time that they released their eponymous debut album in 1975, prog rock had already started seeing its fast decline from the limelight. Yet the band did not immediately give up on their artistic vision, and so in 1976's Look into the Future and 1977's Next, they were still pretty much proggy. The album Next in particular, though, began straying more into the commercial sound, and this shift was received positively, and the album peaked at number 85 on the US Billboards, but this did not help sales grow. Still, Columbia Records had faith in the band and knew that changes had to be made, so they hired a second vocalist to accompany Gregg Rolie and shifted the musical style to hard rock, which ultimately morphed into the beloved arena rock style. This in turn resonated well with the audiences and sales alike, and just like that, Journey as a prog band was no more. Led Zeppelin and Renaissance are sister bands. I remember being shocked the first time I heard about this fact, thus I deemed it appropriate to be on this iceberg. So, the Yardbirds were an English rock band that formed back in 1963 and found major success in the thriving British rock scene until their eventual split in 1968. This band single-handedly kickstarted the careers of guitarists Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page, who were all members of the band at some point or another, and would all go on to become some of the most historically elite guitarists ever. Though by the end of the Yardbirds' first run before their reunion in 1992, the band consisted of 4 members: vocalist and rhythm guitarist Keith Reef, bassist Chris Drea, lead guitarist Jimmy Page, and drummer and backing vocalist Jim McCarthy. Reef and McCarthy wanted to take the band in a more acoustic direction, while Page opted to expand upon the heavy blues sound of the Yardbirds, and with the assistance of band manager Peter Grant, Page was already planning the metamorphosis of the Yardbirds into a new supergroup. This was when Reif and McCarthy established their own separate musical duo called Together and allowed Page to have all the rights for the Yardbirds name, and after one final gig on July 7th, 1968, the band split. Page would go on to hire vocalist Robert Plant, who also brought along drummer John Bonham from their previous group Band of Joy. The band were missing a bassist, and so John Paul Jones was invited after playing with Page earlier that same year. This lineup would be named the New Yardbirds, and they even played a Scandinavian tour that was originally planned for the original Yardbirds lineup, and during September 1968 the band recorded their debut album and decided to rebrand to be known as Led Zeppelin. Meanwhile, Reef and McCarthy released their first 2 singles as a duo, and those saw no commercial success, so the two opted to enlarge their form and added bassist Louis Kenamo, keyboardist John Hawken, and Reef's sister Jane as additional vocalists. This group wanted to venture into a more poetic and classic style of rock and folk music, and that is the sound which they achieved on their debut 1969 album, appropriately titled Renaissance, which ultimately became the band's name. And while the lineup began creating a second album, the band crumbled and by all accounts should have been done and dusted, had it not been for the remaining keyboardist John Hawken, who brought members from his previous band to help finish the album. Renaissance then released their sophomore Illusions album in 1971 before again undergoing a major lineup change that completely substituted all the original founding members and left us with the better known incarnation of Renaissance with Annie Haslam, Michael Dunford, John Tout, John Camp, and Terry Sullivan. And by their heyday, you couldn't believe that Led Zeppelin and Renaissance shared a common ancestor, yet they were both equally thrilling and innovative in their own right. Geddy Lee's parents were Holocaust survivors. Everyone loves Geddy Lee. He is the ultra-talented bassist and vocalist of Canadian heavy prog trio Rush. Yet, on his part, Lee was born to parents who were Holocaust survivors, and despite all odds managed to fall in love in the concentration camps and survive the long war to get back together. Lee's father, Morris Weinreeb, was a Polish Jew, born and raised in Ostrowik-Świętokrzyski city in Poland, while his mother, Mary Rubenstein, grew up in Warsaw and later in Wiecznik. With the Nazi invasion of Poland that marked the start of World War II, the two were taken to the Stradowice ghetto in northern Poland, where they met. The two were then transferred to the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, where they fell in love, and Morris would even bribe the guards to get Mary shoes. No, not new shoes, just shoes. But the two would be separated, and Mary was taken to Bergen-Belsen and Morris to Dachau, where both of them managed to survive for 4 whole years. When liberated, Morris immediately went to search for his long-lost love and found her in the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. The two married and relocated to Canada, and Geddy Lee was born later in 1953. Pink Floyd Frank Zappa Jam. This story takes us back to Belgium 1969. The Actuel magazine were sponsoring a festival which they called the Actuel Rock Festival. The festival was planned to take place in France, but the authorities banned it for fears of disturbances of the public order. So a week before its opening, the festival found refuge in a small town called Amogies in Belgium. The face and presenter of the festival was no other than Frank Zappa, who during the event got around to jamming with many bands that were invited to partake in the event, and one of those bands happened to be Pink Floyd. Now, let's not beat around the bush here. This is 1969 Pink Floyd. The members were young and likely high off their asses from God knows what, and this was topped with their admiration of Zappa, who they viewed as somewhat of a god himself. On the contrary, Zappa was never a big drug fan, and while he did like his tobacco, he stayed away from most other substances, and had a distinct dislike for people getting high on the job or during performances. And this clash of wills can be seen, heck, it can be felt when watching the video of the band jamming with Zappa to Interstellar Overdrive. While Zappa never talked badly about Pink Floyd, he did claim to have no recollections of him playing with them, while alternatively the members of Pink Floyd, who were, mind you, high off their asses, never seemed to have forgotten this unique jam. Hendrix, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I have already given a recollection of the formation of ELP here, but what I have intentionally dismissed was the possible joining of no other than Jimi Hendrix to the supergroup. When Greg Lake and his manager Tony Stratton Smith began looking for potential players to form a supergroup with, drummer Mitch Mitchell from the recently broken up Jimi Hendrix Experience was considered. Mitchell in turn suggested to Lake that they would do a jam session with Jimi Hendrix as well, though at that time Hendrix was occupied with his Band of Gypsies project, so the jam was delayed. And during that same week, Lake got a call from manager Roger Stidgewood, who claimed to have found the perfect drummer for the group, ex-Atomic Rooster and the Crazy World of Arthur Brown drummer Carl Palmer. So an audition took place and Palmer showed great chemistry with Lake and Emerson, which prompted his addition to the cast. And the Jimi Hendrix jam idea? Well, it never came into fruition, but the press did somehow get a hold of the idea of Hendrix jamming with the three members, and so a speculation arose that the new band would go under the acronym of HELP, Hendrix, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Though any hopes of these rumors were eventually dismissed when Hendrix was found lifeless in his London apartment in 1970 at the age of 27. Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. In 1966, the born and raised in Portsmouth Shulman brothers formed a band called the Howling Wolves, which later changed to the Roadrunners. Derek Shulman did vocals, Phil played the saxophone and trumpet while also practicing vocals, and Ray honed on the guitar, violin, trumpet, and wouldn't you know it, vocals. The band began by playing good old rhythm and blues, adding bassist Peter O'Fahey, keyboardist Eric Hine, and drummer Tony Ransley in early 1966, and changing their name to Simon Dupree and the Big Sound for a more flashy name. The band were then signed to EMI's Parlophone label and flopped with their first single. The label then suggested that the band took on a more psychedelic sound, and so their second single, Kites, hit the top 10 in the UK singles chart. Yet the band disliked this, seeing as it was not their musical direction that they wanted to go with, so they attempted 2 other singles that were relatively poorly received. The group then recorded their 1967 album Without Reservations, but made no headway there. In November of '68, the group released 2 singles under the moniker of the Moles, intentionally obscuring their identities, and some rumors were spread that this release was the Beatles going undercover again, a la Klaatu. but still no breakthrough was made for the Simon Dupree and the Big Sound Band, and frustrated with the title of a one-hit wonder band, the group disbanded in 1969 and the Shulman brothers went on to re-establish themselves in 1970's Gentle Giant, which, needless to say, saw a bit more success in their time. Trout Mask Replica is the first math rock album. Let me just come out here and say it. Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica is no math rock album, not even proto-math rock. This is just a false, unsubstantiated claim that really holds no water. I think that this Reddit thread on the matter sums it up better than I could. Math rock is derived from post-hardcore. The entire album predates it by decades and has literally no elements in common with modern math rock. While I think it's a mistake to even try and categorize this album, its biggest influences are jazz and blues, and it's largely an experimental combination of both. To which another Redditor responded with the following video.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine, but
Mr. Bungle invented death metal. Mr. Bungle is the name of an experimental rock band formed in Eureka, California back in 1985. Alongside the ever-intensifying sound of bands like Slayer and Venom at the time, Mr. Bungle was specifically founded with the idea of being a death metal band, which incorporated elements of speed metal and even ska into their sound aesthetics. The band's first live show was held in the Bayside Grange Hall in Bayside, California in November 1985. And the band's first demo tape, titled The Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny, was recorded during the spring of 1986. And while being quite eclectic at times, this demo tape was definitely worthy of the death metal label. And for a demo tape, it quite excels in sound and innovation, to the point where I even found myself rather enjoying it. Though as for the claim that Mr. Bungle was the first death metal band out there, I can neither entirely prove or disprove this, and I fear that no one really can, because it all hinges on subjectivity and semantics. Some might say that Slayer, Venom, and Motorhead did it first, while some cite the American band Possessed as being the first to truly connect the dots in their Seven Churches album. And of course 1983 also saw a couple of childhood friends form the appropriately named Death Band in Florida, which would go on to set the standard for what death metal sounds like. And as far as Mr. Bungle goes, they can be better viewed as the outstanding pioneers of the genre that would ultimately become death metal. Hideous prog album covers. If I went around asking prog heads to point out the most hideous cover art in all of progressive rock, most would probably point out this one as the rightful contender for the crown. This is of course ELP's 1978's Love Beach, which almost became a meme for how bad the cover is, and in turn only helped to amplify the distaste that fans had with this album's musical experience. But what if I told you that there are specimens that are just as equally or even leagues worse than this album cover? Feast your eyes on this. This is Messieurs Bisbee 1974 self-titled album, which is all too cringy and inappropriately suggestive. Or what about Yes's 1994 Talk album, which is definitely more tame but still pales in comparison to anything other that Roger Dean has made for the band's catalog. And what about Rick Wakeman's 1976 No Earthly Connection, and the arguably worst looking Rhapsodies from 1979? Take a look at the unnervingly regurgitated artwork of Nicholas Greenwood's Cold Cuts album, and Jordan Rudess's Rhythm of Time just rubs me the wrong way, and Hawkwind's Space Brock probably doesn't go through censorship today, but I will leave it as it is here. Kansas's Steve Walsh released This American Graphic Nightmare in 1980, and last and definitely least, we have Gong's 2004 Acid Motherhood, which is literally the worst prog album cover ever made, and I obviously had to censor some of it out for this video's sake. The Wall inspired a real Nazi group. Just before Christmas season of 1979, Pink Floyd dropped their 11th studio album, The Wall. Within its inner sleeve, one is greeted with the masterful designs of Gerald Scarfe, who brought the characters and motifs of The Wall to life with his drawings for the album, and later expanded upon them in the 1982 The Wall concept film. And within this inner sleeve, one can clearly see the first hint of the hammers as a motif of The Wall, with the power to erect and destroy this metaphorical title piece at will. When The Wall film did eventually come out to theaters in July of 1982, audiences were greeted with an expansion of the hammer's motif, and towards the end of the film, where the main character of Pink finally loses his sanity, we are presented with a scene of Pink as a fascist cult leader tormenting the captive audience with radicalism, while all around the room banners of hammers are flailing and the crowd mimics their liking with their gestures. All of this symbolism undoubtedly is a reference to Nazi propaganda and imagery, and Pink Floyd and later Roger Waters on his solo shows would play on this imagery in their live shows, and apparently the symbolism of the hammer was so appealing beyond the big screen that thus in 1988 a neo-Nazi group aimed at producing and promoting white power rock music was formed in Dallas, Texas, and as their name they called themselves the Hammerskins, and as their banner they bore the all too familiar red and black crossed hammers.
Post-rock is the spiritual successor to prog rock. Originally, when I wrote the script for this part, I wanted to make the claim that the name post-rock is paradoxical, and that anything that literally comes after rock music is bound to be categorized and become standardized, thus vacating the category for what should be considered as arriving post-rock. But then I remembered that I don't really know anything about post-rock as a subgenre, so I went and listened to the standouts of the category, and my opinion on this entry have changed. So post-rock, as evidenced from its name, is an attempt to categorize the next step in rock music, which was perhaps best encapsulated by Simon Reynolds in the 123rd issue of the music magazine The Wire. There, Reynolds described post-rock as using rock instrumentation for non-rock purposes, using guitars as facilitators of timbres and textures rather than riffs and power chords. And this definition seems to hold up when considering post-rock bands of the time, such as Swans, Bark Psychosis, and the instrumental Tortoise that released their seminal album in the same year as the article. But this definition quickly became flawed as more bands joined the collective post-rock sphere, like Mogwai, Sigur Rós, and the highly influential Godspeed You! Black Emperor, and their groundbreaking sophomore album Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. Suddenly, determining what post-rock actually was became much harder, as the genre expanded in many artistic directions that were harder to bunch up under one umbrella, and even the relation of post-rock to actual rock itself became somewhat disputed. So in a way, post-rock is such a diverse category of its own that it's hard to call it an extension of prog, as it is also a clear continuation of avant-garde, jazz, electronica, and psych rock. And as another final note, usually when discussing the natural evolvement of genres, one can see how creators start off as one thing and then move on to invent their own category of music. It was true for prog bands such as Jethro Tull, Pink Floyd, and Yes, who started off as folk, psych, and pop respectively, only to later morph into what we all call now prog. Yet in the realm of post-rock, there are little creators that began their way in prog and then moved on to establish themselves as a part of the rising, self-defining post-rock genre.
Tim Smith's incest accusations. In 1981, Tim Smith of Cardiacs decided to overhaul the band's lineup and ended up hiring Tim Key on percussions, Dominic Luckman on drums, and Sarah Cutts on saxophone. Together, this six-piece classic lineup recorded their self-released cassette album Toy World. 2 years afterwards, in July of '83, Tim Smith married Sarah Cutts, who would change her surname and become known as Sarah Smith. Now, Tim lacked no sense of good humor, which, like their shows, sometimes got edgy and slightly disturbing, and around 1987 Smith made the sarcastic remark that Sarah and him were sharing the same mum and bed, which in turn embroiled the band in a fair bit of controversy after the Sunday Report posted an article which mistakenly assumed that Tim and Sarah were siblings and that they were engaging in an incestuous relationship. This false rumor was somewhat made more believable when considering that Tim's brother Jim Smith was also a part of the band, and suddenly thinking that Sarah was just another sister did not seem all too unreasonable. Both Tim and Sarah went on to clear up the fog about the whole matter, and did so in their own snarky and sarcastic ways, and from that point onwards the band embraced the false report and made it into a joking matter of their own pleasure. Prog rock is the widest music ever. Prog rock is the widest music ever is the title of an article published in the September 2017 issue of The Atlantic magazine, and it was written by a guy called James Parker, who for some inexplicable reason felt the irrepressible urge to rant about how much he hates progressive rock music. And somewhat more miraculously, no one in the chain of production thought for a moment that this article was just a complete waste of time and ink. Now don't get me wrong, if you have ever read this article you would know that it doesn't even boil a single drop of the reader's blood. It is actually really quite petty, and the whole piece is now viewed as a laughingstock for prog heads, and if I had to summarize it in 2 sentences, those would be something like, "I don't like prog and I hate it. Shouldn't music be objectively good?" Nevertheless, to give you a taste of the absurdity of this article, here are a few snippets from it that are sure to put a smile on your face. When referring to the Cruise to the Edge 5-day experience, Parker rants, "It is a floating orgy of some of the most despised music ever produced by long-haired white men." He also provides a masterful definition and recollection of prog rock in 1 sentence. "The extravagantly conceptual and widely technical post-psychedelic subgenre that ruled the world for about 30 seconds in the early 1970s before being torn to pieces by the starving street dogs of punk rock." And lastly, to really show his true colors, Parker exclaims, "The proggers got away with murder, artistically speaking, and then, like justice, came the Ramones." Well, Mr. James Parker, you can go and listen to your beloved Blitzkrieg Bop, because I have Heart of the Sunrise, and I would not exchange it for the world. Giles, Giles, and Fripp. In August of 1967, the Giles brothers, consisting of vocalist and drummer Michael Giles and bassist and vocalist Peter Giles, posted an advertisement in the paper looking for a keyboardist and vocalist to complete their trio. Then 21-year-old Robert Fripp, a guitarist, replied to the ad and auditioned for the band. Despite not being too skilled in the keys and not being a vocalist at all, he was hired, thus forming the eponymous Giles, Giles and Fripp trio. The band then lived together in a house in Brondesbury Road in London, where they recorded their demos, which they later sent to record labels, which in turn gave them a recording contract with Decca's newly founded Darum Records division. In April of 1968, Giles, Giles and Fripp recorded their debut album together, and it was called The Cheerful Insanity of Giles, Giles and Fripp, with the fitting cover photo to accompany it. The album consisted of 2 stories, divided into subparts. The first was the saga of Rodney Todney, and the second was called Just George, both encompassing a light-hearted baroque/psychedelic pop and interludes of spoken word bits. The album ended up selling poorly, with only about 500 copies being distributed, so the trio decided to double down and expand their cast to include Ian MacDonald on wind instruments and vocalist Judy Dibble. This lineup of the band was short-lived, though in their time the group managed to rehearse several new demos, and when Peter Giles and Judy Dibble left the band later in '68, the remaining Fripp, Giles and MacDonald went on to hire bassist and vocalist Greg Lake and lyricist Peter Sinfield and changed their name to King Crimson, and some of Crimson's early works can be credited to have been made in the Giles, Giles and Fripp era, like an early demo of I Talk to the Wind and Peace and End from In the Wake of Poseidon. Van der Graaf Generator Christmas Song. There is not much of a story behind this entry, but the facts are enjoyable nonetheless. So, as someone who doesn't live in the UK and whose parents were not even born back in 1971, it can sometimes get difficult to grasp what the BBC radio experience at the time might have been like, and what the producers deemed a good use of radio time and what wasn't. But I guess that someone over on the BBC team thought that it would be a nice idea to invite the members of Van der Graaf Generator, just coming off the release of Pawn Hearts in November, and to ask them to record a Christmas song that could be aired later in December. And much like the similar entry with Pink Floyd performing a Christmas song for the BBC, it seems that Van der Graaf Generator also took the piss out of this one, but in a good-natured way. So on December 14th, 1971, Van der Graaf Generator went into the BBC studios with their former ex-lead vocalist Chris Judge Smith, who was still a friend of the band at the time, and recorded a piece that would later be nicknamed An Epidemic of Father Christmas, a glaring parody of their epic A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers from the Pawn Hearts album. And the recording aired alongside Lemmings and Refugees on December 29th and again on February 15th, 1972. And for what it's worth, the song itself is rather enjoyable and filled with Christmas whimsy, but the only existing recording is quite low quality and can only be found on a bootleg called The Band of Millions of Years featuring the Undercover Man. But I feel as if I should say this is a really interesting song, and I enjoy listening to it in the off time, so if you don't know it yet, you should go and check it out. Nectar's Show Me the Way is in an episode of The Jeffersons. Nectar is a prog band formed back in 1969 in Hamburg, Germany, yet all of its members were Englishmen, so the band is generally regarded as an English progressive rock group. And Nectar saw a blasting start with 1971's Journey to the Center of the Eye, which told one continuous story about an astronaut's journey guided by knowledge given to them by extraterrestrials. The band followed the album with 1972's A Tab in the Ocean, which leaned more into the traditional rock and blues style, but still maintaining progressive integrity. And while 1973's Sounds Like This was a bit of a too long to improvise hiccup in their repertoire, the band blew it out of the water again with 1973's Remember the Future. And at this time the band has gained itself quite a cult following, and it is quite safe to assume that one of their fans at the time was one Mr. Sherman Hemsley. Hemsley was a jazz keyboardist with a deep appreciation to music, and he later ventured into a successful career as an actor of all things. Hemsley got the role of a supporting character in the American television sitcom All in the Family in 1973, but his real breakthrough happened when his part in the show received its own spin-off series in 1975 and became the beloved show known as The Jeffersons, where Hemsley would play George Jefferson, the father and protagonist of the series, appearing in all 253 episodes of the show. And in one faithful episode of the first season of The Jeffersons, Hemsley's character can be seen waltzing into the room as Lionel's character is listening to Nectar's Show Me the Way track from their 1974 album Down to Earth. Take a look.
What'd you say? I said it's great music. What you turn it off for?
Now, this choice of song might seem random to most, but what I've yet to mention is that Sherman Hemsley was a prog fan of severe magnitude, and he probably owned all of Nectar's records and was well familiar with them at the time, which is likely how this semi-obscure song made it onto the Jeffersons. It is also fitting to note here that Hemsley was one of the biggest Gong fans ever, and his admiration of the band is wholly unmatched. And for a fun anecdotal story, there is a case of how Hemsley met David Ellen of Gong. Around 1978 to 79, Hemsley got hold of David Ellen's phone number and kept calling him ceaselessly, and Ellen, who was living television-less life in Spain at the time, did not know who Hemsley was or of his fame. At some point, Ellen decided to take that call and found out that the man on the other side was a bit of a nut who promised to fly Ellen to him in LA. Ellen then asked if Hemsley could pay for him and his wife to have a honeymoon stop in Jamaica, to which Hemsley excitedly agreed. And so it came to be that Sherman Hemsley and David Ellen of Gong met, and Sherman offered some weed, which Ellen, a non-smoker, surprisingly refused. When the two men got to Hemsley's house, he remarked that they shouldn't go downstairs because there was an LSD laboratory in the basement, and things only got weirder when the two went into a room on the top floor with its windows all blacked out and a tape of Gong's album Flying Teapot playing on endless repeat. So yeah, just felt like telling this story here instead of making it into its own entry, which I probably should have, but it's too late for that now. Adrian Bellew was jumped during the making of Thela Hun Gingit. After King Crimson released Red in 1974, the band went into hibernation for an undisclosed amount of time, and fans were just left waiting to see if a new album ever came out. And indeed, in the autumn of 1980, as progressive rock died as the face of rock music and punk took its place, Robert Fripp was ready to reform King Crimson and start creating music again. Fripp went on to contact drummer Bill Bruford about his intentions, and he then recruited bassist Tony Levine and vocalist Adrian Bellew to the band. This also marked the first time where Fripp would voluntarily add a second guitarist to their lineup, a decision that proved positively influential on the band's 80s debut album, Discipline. During the making of Discipline, Bellew and Fripp tossed around the idea of making a song about the crime in the city of London, especially affected by the recent assassination of John Lennon in the year prior. The name given to the song is a play on the idea of crime in the city, which the band interpreted as heat in the jungle, heat meaning weapons in this context. But the instrumentals of the song encompassed a sort of tribal African sound, so Bellew opted to change the name, and he did so by using the name Hid in the Jungle to create an anagram of Thelahun Ginjeet, which had a right zing and could be sung better on the instrumental track. Yet the band struggled with writing proper lyrics for most of the song, and Bellew only had the idea of a line that reads, "He held a gun against me, this is a dangerous place," which he then recorded on his Walkman tape. But in order to hinder his writer's block, Fripp advised Bellew to take a stroll out in the streets and record whatever ideas naturally came up to him. So Bellew started walking and talked into his tape recorder when he suddenly noticed a couple of British Jamaican Rastafarians eyeing him suspiciously, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by 5 or 6 thugs. The ringleader then told Bellew to play the tape, and when he refused, the tape was wrestled out of his hands and turned on. And to Bellew's dismay, the recently recorded lines of "He held the gun, this is a dangerous place" came emanating from the device. The gang was rightfully unhappy about this and suspected that Bellew was an undercover cop, which he wasn't, and tried to communicate this fact to them. Finally, the gang began opening up the tape recorder, thinking that they might find stashed drugs inside, which wasn't the case, and after what probably felt like an eternity, the Rastafarians left Adrian alone. Bellew then rushed back to the studio and began retelling a story that just transpired to the band, and at some point Robert Fripp signaled the engineer to start recording, and this is the recollection that can ultimately be found on Thelahun Ginjeet. Genesis 1975 Tour Explosion. When I first read the title of this entry, I was pretty confused. On January 1st, 2023, I concluded my year-long project of 365 Days of Prog on this channel with a full comprehensive review of Genesis's The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and I knew well that when the band toured the album after its release, it was already known and mutually agreed upon that Peter Gabriel would be departing the band when the tour concluded. So the idea that some sort of internal explosion happened within the band during the time seemed not right to me, but boy was I wrong in my reading of this title. When touring with The Lamb, Genesis began their tour in the United States, and the tour's success prompted band manager Tony Stratton Smith to propose touring the album through Europe as well. And on the literal first night of the tour, which began on February 15th, 1975 in Oslo, Norway, the band were involved in an unexpected hazardous event that could have changed the course of Genesis and its members' lives forever. The show itself went pretty well, and a full sound recording of it can be found online, and upon arrival to the final closing track on the album, being It, the band went back on stage to play it as their encore. The crowd loved it, everyone had a good time, and as Phil Collins was playing his final crescendo on the set, a large bang and a flash could be seen and heard by everyone around, after which the band went eerily silent, never quite concluding the show as per usual. You see, this exploding ending to the show was entirely planned and had been executed to perfection during many US tour shows, but there was one oversight on this fateful night. Apparently, European stage explosives are not like American stage explosives, as they are 3 times more powerful. This fact seems to have flown over the head of then Genesis roadie Peter Hart, who did not change the pyrotechnics accordingly. The explosion resulted in the crowd being shocked, a part of the stage was blown to smithereens, and Phil Collins was especially livid by the event, that when after the explosion Hart's voice pipped,
"Sorry," from the side of the stage, Collins erupted by replying, "You're sorry? You're fired!" That same day, a lesson was learned, and despite the shock, the tour went onwards as usual, concluding the very successful run for Genesis' original lineup and Peter Gabriel's tenure with the band. Rick Wakeman eating curry on stage. To wrap up this long section of the iceberg, we have a story that left me audibly laughing when I first heard it. This event took place during one of the two Yes concerts that were held in Manchester either on November 28th or 29th of 1973. The band had just released Tales from Topographic Oceans and were touring, playing the entire 80+ minutes album in their set. One person who was distinctly disenchanted with the album was keyboardist Rick Wakeman, who described the album like wading through a cesspool to get to the water lily, basically implying that there were good parts on the album and a lot of in-between padding. And it has been a commonplace practice that during live shows at the time, Wakeman's analog keyboards would often malfunction during the act, and so humorously enough, band roadie John Cleary would go on stage with Yes and lay down beneath Wakeman's Hammond organ, and he was ready to jump into action the moment that there were any repairs needed. And in the quieter moments when Wakeman did not have any substantial playing to do, the two would often spark up conversations, with Wakeman sitting on his pedestal and Cleary awkwardly communicating from the floor. And as the story goes, in one of those Manchester shows where Yes had played Topographic Oceans in its entirety, Wakeman thought that he had heard Cleary asking him, "What are you doing after the show?" To which he replied with, "I'm going to have a curry." Cleary followed up with, "Right, what would you order?" And Wakeman then answered with, "Chicken vindaloo, pilau rice, half a dozen pompadums, biondi bhaji, Bombay aloo, and a stuffed paratha." To which Cleary simply nodded. About a half an hour later, while in the middle of playing, Wakeman caught a waft of the distinct scent of curry on stage. He looked around only to find Cleary holding up a bowl of Indian takeaway. It was exactly what he had ordered, except he didn't think he had ordered anything. And well, the sight of the curry was all too appetizing, and it was bound to get cold. And seeing as he didn't have to focus too much on the playing at that moment, Wakeman started digging into his bowl of chicken vindaloo, pilau rice, half a dozen pompadums, biondi bhaji, Bombay aloo, and stuffed paratha, placing the whole ordeal on one of his unused keyboards. But Wakeman's meal did not go unnoticed, and John Anderson also caught waft of the smell, so he looked around to see his bandmate munching on a piece of pompadum bread. Bewildered, Anderson approached Wakeman, took a look at the culinary insult, and went back to the microphone, with the customary piece of pompadum in hand. Christian Vander Nazi allegations. Christian Vander is the founder of Magma and the Zool subgenre as a whole, and while many in the prog sphere never get around to liking Zool, there are also many who love its absurd alien avant-garde style, and Christian Vander should be credited for bringing this form of music to life. With that said, about a decade and a half ago, some concerning allegations about Vander and his beliefs have surfaced, especially as the online platforms for Zool lovers have grown, specifically stories of Vander allegedly holding ideologies that seem to glorify Nazism and Hitler himself. In 1998, keyboardist Emanuel Borghi, who had been friends and associate of Vander for several years prior, joined Magma and stayed with the band until early 2008. Then in the same year, Borghi came out with allegations about Vander and his beliefs, stating about Vander online the following. "He did with me what he did with a lot of people. He tried to convince me that all the world was a mistake, that history had been falsified, and that he knew the truth. He was convinced, and he still is, that Adolf Hitler was a benefactor for humanity." Borghi would later go on to discuss how there are lyrics on Mechanik Destruktiv Kommando that directly translate to "Für mein Führer Adolf Hitler," which is honestly not all too surprising considering the wartime Nazi Germany feel that this album has. And he also pointed out how there are some Magma albums that simply contain the credit "Thank you to our uncle" on them. That uncle is canonically Adolf Hitler as well.
When Vander's wife Stella was asked about his beliefs and the possibility of confronting him about them, she neither confirmed nor denied them, and simply stated that he is entitled to his own thoughts. Yet, somewhat contractingly, Stella is Jewish, and many more stories and allegations going both ways have surfaced about Christian Vander's beliefs, and I guess that for now everyone is left to take this information in whatever direction they feel right and do whatever they deem fitting with it. The Eye von Satan. While not being the most exciting song from Tool's 1996 album Anima, The Eye von Satan, which translates to Satan's eggs in German, is lyrically unique as it simply contains a recipe for some sort of baked good, and the recipe goes as follows. Half a cup of powdered sugar, a quarter teaspoon of salt, 1 knife's tip worth of Turkish hashish, half a pound of butter, a tablespoon of vanilla sugar, which I would honestly substitute for a dash of pure vanilla extract, but what do I know? A half a pound of flour, 150 grams of ground nuts, a little extra powdered sugar, and most importantly, no eggs. The recipe then goes on to instruct placing all the ingredients in a bowl and knead before shaping the dough into small eyeball-sized shapes covered in powdered sugar, and then chanting the preliminary Simsalabim Bamba Saladu Saladim, and then baking in the oven for 200 degrees for 15 minutes roughly. And again, no eggs. Now, I was gonna do a gag here where I try and make this recipe, but for the sake of health and legality, I would use oregano instead of vanilla. Oh, did I say vanilla? I meant Turkish hashish. And then to try, of course, the baked good out. But luckily, some mad lad by the name of r/adulting sucks already made the pastry 2 years ago, hashish and all, and he posted his thoughts on the recipe on the Tool subreddit, noting that everything came out delicious, crispy, and very strong. And as a final remark, he suggested to bake on 170 degrees for a total of 12 minutes for a better result overall. Brain salad surgery's phallic secret. Emerson, Lake and Palmer's 1973 Brain Salad Surgery album holds more phallic secrets than First Meet the Eye. Initially, the working title of the album was Whip Some Skull on Ya, which is a slang for fellatio. With this name in mind, ELP went on their 1973 European tour, during which they played 2 nights in Zurich. Then Manticore manager Peter Zumsteg knew of an artist living in Zurich at the time, whose works might be appealing to the band for the cover of their upcoming album. The artist's name was Hans-Rudi Geiger, and his works were very much disturbing, industrial, biomechanical, and dark in many ways. And as it so happened, when the trio went to meet with Geiger, they were awestruck from seeing a triptych piece of his called Work 216, Landscape 19. Keith Emerson was especially impressed by it and felt that Geiger was the man they were looking for, so the band commissioned 2 pieces from him, which would ultimately become Work 217 ELP-1 and Work 218 ELP-2, the latter being a triptych itself. And not long after the meeting, the working title for the album was changed to Brain Salad Surgery, still referring to fellatio, though this time more poetically perhaps, and the idea of the title came from a lyric of Dr. John's 1973 summer hit, Right Place, Wrong Time. After a short while, the 2 artworks were made, and the sleeve design for the upcoming album featured a unique unfolding mechanism that sets the album packaging apart from any other at the time. However, Geiger decided that it was only appropriate for a certain phallic organ to be drawn directly underneath the face of the woman featured in the cover, which the record company did not like, as it wasn't discreet like the rest of the album's sexual innuendos, so Geiger was asked to paint that object out, which he refused to do. And so a separate artist was hired to airbrush the penis, the penis, out of the image. But let's be truthful, it is still pretty much there, and if you didn't notice it until today, well, sorry for ruining your mental image of this album. Kevin Gilbert's cause of death. Kevin Matthew Gilbert was born on November 20th, 1966 in Sacramento, California. Kevin's brother Greg would later state that quite suddenly at the age of 13, Kevin became disinterested in sleeping and eating and became much more infatuated with reading and composing. This marked somewhat of a beginning for Kevin Gilbert's musical career, as aside from composing, Gilbert was also a capable keyboardist, guitarist, bassist, celloist, and drummer. While still in school, Gilbert formed his first musical duo with John Hubbard called NRG, which stands for No Reasons Given, and the two released an album of the same name in 1984. Right from the start, Gilbert would make his mark as a progressive rock artist, in a time where prog was quite literally dying. So Gilbert embraced the changing musical scene and helped to pioneer the neo-prog/crossover prog scene of the time. Gilbert would continue his career with several projects, as a part of his band Giraffe, and with the one-off project of Toy Manatee with Mark Bonilla and later his girlfriend Sheryl Crow. In 1996, Gilbert partnered with his ex-Toy Manatee bandmate Brian McLeod to create a new musical duo called Caviar, which would mark a departure from his usual style of writing and focusing on heavier material and darker lyrics. But the project was cut short by a dark and abrupt ending to Gilbert's life on May 18, 1996, where he was found dead in his Los Angeles home. The cause of death was asphyxia due to partial hanging, though this was no matter of voluntary suicide, but rather a very unfortunate case of autoerotic asphyxiation. Kevin Gilbert is remembered fondly as a promising musician by all whom he worked with, and many unreleased and work-in-progress materials of his were completed and released posthumously in the years after his passing. Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 1 Voice Lines. In 1973, King Crimson released their fifth studio album titled Lark's Tongues in Aspic. The album opens up with the first part of the eponymous piece, where at the end of it, 3 vocal recordings can be found. Starting from the end and going backwards, we can hear what sounds to be 3 voices mumbling in an incantation-like manner as the song comes to a close. These 3 voices are well recorded and are identified as King Crimson members Bill Bruford, David Cross, and Jamie Moore reading newspapers simultaneously. Yet the more interesting recordings are the 2 that come prior to this one, and they are much less audible in sound quality and sound less like a studio recording and more like an excerpt taken from a film or a TV series. Take a listen to these recordings as they are extracted from the center channel of the 5.1 mix of the album.
Did I ever show you where the persecutor shot the praying weaver, my dear? To go home, mother. It's good for you, dearie. How was Eric in it?
I wouldn't worry about that sore throat of yours. A good hanging's the best cure for it, I know. Second job. It is the sentence of this court.
What are these recordings, you might ask? Well, when I started working on this video, these recordings were still considered to be lost media. But on October 16th, 2024, users Singing Sheep YTPs on YouTube uploaded their findings to their channel. In their video, Sheep details how there had been a false conception that these voices were recordings of a Scottish radio drama called Gallows Glass, which is easily disproven seeing as the series was written in 1991. Yet it seems that this assumption came to be because of the judge's verdict recording on the album. Sheep then noticed that one online commenter mentioned that a TV series based on a book called Weir of Hermiston was airing on BBC Scotland around the time when Larks was being recorded, meaning that it could have been recorded straight from a TV and put on the album. Sheep then got a copy of the book, and they did manage to find a striking resemblance between the story and the recording, so the next logical step would be to find the original series. Unfortunately though, the series was aired in 1973, received a supercut around 77, but was never released to the public elsewhere, thus making it lost. It was only when Sheep found a distributor of old archived TV series that they'd managed to locate and get access to the full 4-episode series. And wouldn't you know it, the first episode of the series had not one, but both recordings that ended up on the album. And before I show them to you, I would like to say a huge thank you to you Singing Sheep for doing this big service to the prog community, and also for allowing me to cover this case rather spontaneously in this video. So without further ado, enjoy.
He used to go over there and come and pick them and take them home. Did I ever show you where the persecutor shot the praying weaver, my dear? To go home, mother. It's good for you, dearie. How was Eric in it?
A good hanging's the best cure for it, I know. Second job. It is the sentence of this court. You'll be taken from this place to the Tolbooth of Edinburgh. There for the house.
John Martyn's Solid Air is about Nick Drake. In December of 1967, Nick Drake was doing a gig in the London Camden Town, and his performance made an impression on one Ashley Hutchings of a folk band called Ferryport Convention. Hutchings liked Drake's appearance and guitar skills alike, and in turn introduced him to producer Joe Boyd, who had an immediate bond with Drake. Through Boyd, Nick Drake likely met fellow folk guitarist John Martyn, and the two became good friends. Quite close friends actually, but even close friends of Drake would remark that it was hard maintaining a close relationship with him, as he was an extreme introvert and suffered from depression and prone to nervous breakdowns. Despite his personal challenges, Nick Drake was able to express himself through his music, and he released his first studio album, 5 Leaves Left, in 1969, the same year when John Martyn married fellow folk musician Beverly Martyn, who also became close friends with Drake. In 1971, Drake released his second album, Brighter Later, and the following year he released his most acclaimed and final album, Pink Moon. In 1973, Nick Drake went back into his London studio with producer Joe Boyd, and in spite of his declining mental state, the studio time made him genuinely happier. John Martyn was aware of Nick's mental state and decided to compose a song dedicated to him, after which he named his 1973 album Solid Air. But not 18 months after Martyn released his song, Nick Drake would be found dead in his parents' house. The cause of death was deemed suicide by acute amitriptyline poisoning. About a month before his passing, Martyn and Drake got into a heated argument that was never resolved, and Martyn carried this burden for the rest of his life. But the story is made all the more baffling when listening to John Martyn's Solid Air. Its lyrics and somber composition all seem to poetically lament Drake and his going through life, and had I not known, I feel that this same assumption would have been that this song was composed posthumously, yet it was not. Elton John was almost a Gentle Giant or King Crimson member. In the past entry, I mentioned Simon Dupree and Big Sound, which is basically Proto-Gentle Giant, and I intentionally neglected mentioning one part of this story of formation. In the initial incarnation of Simon Dupree, the Shulman brothers partnered with Eric Hine as their keyboard player, but before their Scotland tour in 1967, Hine fell ill and needed a temporary replacement, which is when an unknown keyboardist named Reginald Dwight was hired to take Hine's place in the tour. Dwight performed well enough to almost grant him a permanent member status in the band, but it ultimately never went through. Dwight also had some original materials which he had been working on, and he proposed to record them with the band, which they politely declined. And later Dwight shared with the band his intentions to adopt the stage name of Elton John, which the band replied to with mild amusement. Reginald Dwight would go on to release some of his offered compositions on his debut album Empty Sky in 1969 under the pseudonym Elton John. In that same year, King Crimson released their game-changing debut album, but their momentum would be thwarted by the departure of Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles, which also led Greg Lake to look for a way out of the band to form his new group with the nice keyboardist Keith Emerson. So in an attempt to fill in the vacancies, several people were auditioned, and one Elton John was invited to sing as a session musician. But that audition never went through after Robert Fripp spun Elton's Empty Sky record and realized, much like the Shulman brothers have, that he was indeed not the man they were looking for. Al Stewart's first guitar teacher was Robert Fripp. Al Stewart probably needs no introduction here. He is a highly successful British guitarist and singer-songwriter with a variety of albums stretching from 1967 to 2008, with the aptly titled 1973 Past, Present and Future album marking a conceptual change in Stewart's music that became more interested in history and the documentation of historical events through song. But in the early days of his career, Stewart somehow managed to cross paths with several noteworthy names that would later, much like him, become renowned musicians. In 1965, Al would share a London apartment with Paul Simon of all people, and the first guitar he had ever bought was from future Police guitarist Andy Summers. And while living in the area of Wimborne and still attending school, Stewart would take the bus with another kid who offered to teach him to play the guitar. So the two did roughly 10 lessons together
together, though Al never really complied with anything that his teacher told him. And you probably guessed it by now, but that teacher was future King Crimson founder Robert Fripp. Now, Fripp was always known to bolster a large community of guitar students, establishing his impressively creepy league of crafty guitarists. Yet, when later asked if any of his students actually broke through, he replied that only one did, and he did so by not listening to him. That student was, of course, Al Stewart. Steve Hackett's cheese incident. Staying on the Robert Fripp line of thinking, in the early 70s under Robert Fripp's diligent guidance, King Crimson became the mother of all prog bands. This status was especially reflected well with the up-and-coming Genesis, who at the time looked up to King Crimson and had many pieces of equipment that were hand-me-downs from Crimson. But the relationship between the two bands was also very friendly, and members often socialized outside of work, such as one instance where Genesis guitarist Steve Hackett was invited by Fripp to a dinner party. Not long before this night, King Crimson went into hiatus, though before dropping the ball on that decision, Fripp offered the guitarist's role to Steve Hackett, seeing as Hackett planned to depart Genesis and Robert had had enough with the musical industry at the time, though Hackett politely declined this offer. Going back to the dinner party though, Hackett would later describe in his autobiography how he was keeping away from the salad and instead kept nibbling away at the cheddar cheese. The excessiveness of his cheese eating ultimately made Fripp's controlling instinct kick in, and he straight up told Hackett that he can't have any more cheese. And how did Hackett respond? Well, he took another little nibble from the cheddar, and the two have been on a 40+ year feud ever since. The Residents' Mark of the Mole Atari 2600 game. The Residents are a band that, to me, feel like the unholy amalgamation of Frank Zappa and Buckethead. Getting into the Residents' extensive 60+ album discography is a challenge, and their own self-constructed universe of avant-garde songs, short films, and stage performances is a lot to wrap your head around, though this entry specifically focuses on one small bump in the Residents' anthology. In 1981, the Residents released their 8th studio album, Mark of the Mole, and a fan of the band who also happened to work as a game developer for Atari was contacted by the band in an offer to transform the album into a video game and use the album's music as its soundtrack. That developer's name was Greg Easter, and he began working on the game in 1982 and kept laboring over it in the following year as well. From this time, we have several photos and documentations of the game in its infancy and work-in-progress stages. We also know that the game had the player play as the mole, going from chamber to chamber and reconstructing musical pieces by the Residents and mimicking notes, which, funnily enough, was basically the game training the user to develop perfect pitch. Also from that time, in a short comprehensive documentary about the state of music-inspired video games, we can see the one and only video recording of the game in action. Do you want to see it? Well, here it is. Did you catch it? Well, I can play it again. Yes, this is all we have, because in 1984 the video game industry went into recession, and Greg Easter would leave Atari and abandon the Mark of the Mole project in the process, though there are rumors of a prototype of the game being circulated in private circles of Atari enthusiasts, but no version of this game has ever surfaced to the public. Frank Zappa considered running for president with Atros Parrott as his vice president. Frank Zappa indeed always had a political edge to him, and while never outright spewing political agendas at his audience, he had his own nuanced ways of sharing his beliefs and ideologies with the world. In 1986, Zappa would partake in a debate where he openly described himself as a conservative. In 1990, Zappa was watching a TV symposium where prominent Democratic and Republican figures discussed the possible unraveling outcomes of the 1992 presidential elections. And in 1991, Zappa would discuss the hypothetical idea of him running for President of the United States. Frank was partially inspired by veteran Democrat consultant Raymond Stother, who stated that the American presidency needed an outsider, like the British Zappa, but he didn't say that last part. Nevertheless, Zappa did contact Stother about the viability of his campaign, but their interaction never really led to anything concrete.
Most of Zappa's running for president story is littered with ifs and whens, and never quite came into fruition. Zappa noted that he is even qualified for the job because he took no vacations and didn't play golf. He also noted that as president he would eliminate federal income tax, raise the state taxes, and get the government out of people's faces. Additionally, Zappa named Texas-based businessman Ross Perot as his first vice president, despite never talking to the man. Perot would actually run independently in the 1992 elections, but would ultimately be unsuccessful, and Zappa on his behalf would never go through with this presidential idea, as he was fighting prostate cancer since 1990, which would ultimately claim his life in late 1993. Arbeit macht frei's radicalism. Aria is an Italian progressive rock band that was a big part of the bombastic development of the RPI scene in the 70s in Italy. The band formed in Milan in 1972 with 6 initial members, while the band was being led musically and thematically by Egyptian-born Demetrios Stratos. In 1973, the band made waves with their debut album Arbeit macht frei, which is still seen as an Italian classic today, and while the album featured endearing jazz fusion and avant-prog music, it had a different aspect that resonated well with many of its audiences. As I have noted before, the rise of the Italian prog scene was helped a lot by the rapid distancing of Italy's younger generations from the religion and church, and their adoption of left-leaning ideologies that were often the conceptual topics of Italian prog bands. And Aria was the band who had likely the most radical message of all. The album Arbeit macht frei makes a bold pro-Palestinian statement, helped perhaps in part by Demetrios Stratos, hailing from the relatively pro-Palestinian country of Egypt. The first track on the album, translated to July-August Black September, which became a great hit for the band, references the Palestinian liberation group Black September, whose name was taken from their armed conflict in Jordan during September of 1970, and who would later assassinate Jordanian Prime Minister in 1971. But the band were indeed radical in their views, and they did not disdain from appearing as such on their debut album. First, in the year prior to the album's release, the Black September terror group committed the Munich Summer Olympic massacre, where 11 Israeli coaches and athletes were murdered in cold blood, as well as 1 German police officer. Aria's decision to reference the terror group and show support for their claim made it so that the album was highly censored from any radio play in Italy, yet it succeeded nonetheless. Secondly, the album's title and name of its second track is taken from the infamous slogan printed in metal letterings at the enter of the Auschwitz concentration camp, where 32 years prior, Geddy Lee's parents were being held. Though this song is much more abstract with its lyrics and doesn't directly imply anything other than its name. And lastly, there is the gun. When opening the gatefold for the album, one is immediately greeted with a behind-the-scenes photo of the band, where they can be slumped next to a wall as a print of the Auschwitz gate can be seen on the floor, near the customary hammer and sickle, while one of the band members is sporting a keffiyeh. But perhaps more notably is the gun cutout that is placed in the album's gatefold. This Andy Warhol type gun print simply reads Aria International Popular Group, and then continues with the Latin phrase for corpus delicti, which literally means body of the crime, referring to the cutout gun as the evidence device used to commit a crime. And the question has to be asked, what crime did Aria try to refer to here? And I have heard speculation saying that this gun was the one used to assassinate the Prime Minister of Jordan, Wassaf Tal, or perhaps it had been one of the Munich terrorists' guns, or perhaps it was something else entirely. The Pope made a prog album. The Pope, or the Bishop of Rome, is the visible head of Catholicism, and to this day there have been 266 Roman pontiffs. The last 3 reigning popes had been Pope John Paul II, followed by Pope Benedict XVI, and succeeded by the current Pope, Pope Francis. And during John Paul II's papacy, which began in 1978 and ended in 2005, the Pope was approached with a unique idea of creating an album which is lyrically based on his preachings
teachings and biblical passages. The Pope agreed to the project, and thus a classical album containing 11 individual tracks would be created. The album would be composed by Leonardo de Amicis and released in 1999 in anticipation of the Great Jubilee for Radio Vaticana, the official radio broadcast of the Vatican. With this album titled Abba Pater, a tradition began in the papacy, whereas a pope would have an album released under their name, with a composition accompanying parts of their speeches and biblical teachings. And in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI released a similarly classical album called Alma Mater, which means Nourishing Mother, which accompanies the title for John Paul's album, which translates to Good Father. And in 2015, under the artistic direction of Don Giulio Neroni, who worked on the previous two popes' albums, the album Wake Up by Pope Francis was released. And while this one retained the classical and preaching nature of the previous two, it also incorporated the distinct element of progressive rock into the mix, and this was done in part by the added artistic direction of Tony Pagliuca of the Italian prog band Le Orme, who worked on this project as well. And I gave this album a listen back in 2022, and while I guess it counts as prog, it is quite a loose definition of the genre, with classical world music and spoken word being much more fitting genres for the classification of this album. Steve Hillage and Jeff Downs' Twitter fight. Twitters can sometimes act as the final fortitude of the old Wild West internet, and the Twitter platform often sets a stage for the weirdest of conversations and interactions, much like the feud that happened between Khan and Gong's Steve Hillage and Yes and Aza's Jeff Downs back in 2019. The whole ordeal began when Downs made the claim that DJs aren't musicians, and that their craft is simply to play records made by other musicians, basically downplaying the role that DJs play in the music scene and implying that there is little to no effort in their craft. This bold statement was then replied to by Steve Hillage, who called BS on the whole claim and posed the real question that DJs can ignite a dance floor crammed with people, unlike some musicians. But the argument was not merely sparked by the logical response, but by Hillage stabbing at Downs, claiming that he can't even play the guitar, and that all he does is just push buttons, which is likewise a huge understatement of what keyboard players do. The rest of this feud is highly entertaining to read and continued for about a week on and off, and I'm not going to recap the whole detailings here, as there is really not a lot to take from this argument, but I hope that the snippets on the screen might help you see the childish nature of these two prog masterminds clashing online. Genesis and Van der Graaf Generator covers stolen and lost during the 1982 acquisition of Charisma Records. In 1969, former journalist Tony Stratton Smith founded the Charisma record label, and he managed to sign and propel the careers of several prog bands such as The Nice, Van der Graaf Generator, and Genesis. In 1970, Tony Stratton Smith met an artist by the name of Paul Whitehead, whose work he liked, and Whitehead was given the offer to illustrate the cover for Genesis's upcoming album Trespass, which he did. The original painting for Trespass, along with the rest of Paul Whitehead covers while working with Charisma Records, were kept in the Charisma archives, until when around 1982 to 1983, the Charisma record label was sold to Richard Branson, the owner of the now successful Virgin Records label. When news got hold that the purchase would take place, the Charisma staff began looting their own offices, which is when the covers for Genesis's Trespass, Nursery Crime, and Foxtrot, as well as Van der Graaf Generator's H to He Who Am the Only One, and Pawn Hearts suddenly disappeared. The original illustrations for the albums are still considered lost till today, and no further information exists concerning their present location. Brain Salad Surgery lost in 2005. In direct continuation of the last entry, another album that saw the original illustrations for its cover become lost and never to be relocated is ELP's Brain Salad Surgery. As mentioned prior, Brain Salad Surgery's cover includes two artworks made roughly in the size of a standard vinyl sleeve. Those are Work 217 ELP1 and Work 218 ELP2. Between April 14th and August 31st of 2005, an exhibition of H.R. Giger's work was held in Prague in the Czech Republic. The two aforementioned paintings spent the entire time of the exhibition up and present for the public to examine, and when the exhibition has ended, all of the paintings were taken down and put safely in a locked room and left there for a weekend. On September 5th, the artworks were packaged and loaded on a truck to be taken back to Switzerland, and upon arrival at their destination, it was discovered that two works have gone missing. Of course, work 217 and work 218. The thing about this supposed art theft is that the perpetrator intentionally only took the two paintings and left the others intact, meaning that they likely knew of their importance in relation to ELP's work and thus took only them and kept the rest intact. And while this might stray into conspiracy, it is not unsafe to assume that the paintings were taken and perhaps resold to an anonymous buyer who was a fan of the album and wanted the unattainable novelty of owning the originals for the cover art themselves. In any case, this is still an open case, and the H.R. Giger Museum is offering a $5,000 bounty for the successful retrieval of each of the two paintings, as well as the odd prize of a paid vacation to Chateau Saint-Germain or Gruyère, no questions asked. L. Ron Hubbard's Fusion Album. L. Ron Hubbard is an extreme science fiction author who, after losing the rights to his books in 1952, established the Church of Scientology, which is a bizarro version of Christianity and xenophilic science fiction that somehow caught on as a religion and swept many, most notably big figures in Hollywood such as Tom Cruise and John Travolta. Though even after the startling success of Scientology, Hubbard kept on writing and publishing works of science fiction, and in 1982 he published what might just be his most acclaimed work, the 1,000+ pages long Battlefield Earth, a saga of the year 3000, and alongside the writing of the book, Hubbard also fully composed an album to go alongside it, titled Space Jazz. While his book received the status of a semi-classic in the sci-fi field, the album was not graced by the same love. Actually, Space Jazz has gained itself a reputation of a cheesy, digitized, and fairly cringy retelling of the original source material. And I tried giving this album a listen, and I felt queasy throughout most of it, and I genuinely feel that stripping the album away from all its vocals and making it into a video game soundtrack could kinda work, but as it is, this is nothing to write home about, and it marks one other weird artistic venture made by Hubbard during his eventful life. Wolf Zendik. Lawrence E. Wolfing was born on October 7, 1920 in El Paso, Texas, and grew up in pre-World War II America. After the war, Wolfing developed a spiritual approach to the world and the future of humanity, and detailed his thoughts in two books, A Quest Among the Bewildered and Zendik, which means heretic or outlaw in Sanskrit. In the mid-60s, Wolfing met his future wife-to-be, Carol Merson Weinberg, and the two would change their names, with Carol becoming Errol Wolf and Lawrence becoming Wolf Zendik. In 1969, the two established the Zendik Art Farm in a ranch owned by Zendik's parents in Paris, California. There, the couple began accepting new residents who wanted to leave the livelihood of modern life and to follow the spiritual teachings of Wolf Zendik, who was adamant that his goal was to save humanity and change the world for the better. As well as being an author, philosopher, and a poet, Wolf Zendik also took interest in composition, and he even constructed his own 8-stringed instrument called the itar, which was a combination of the guitar and the sitar, which seemed to work very well with his own natural voice. With this instrument and an array of buzzing guitars and African percussions, Wolf Zendik would create several compositions that can be found on his 1972 album Zendik. Later on, more Wolf Zendik albums would surface, but they were mostly made of materials composed and performed by members of the Zendik farm and his wife Errol. And while describing himself as an undiscovered beat of his time, Wolf Zendik would also be remembered as an unlikely early pioneer of the reggae prog subgenre. Wolf Zendik would pass away on June 12, 1999, funnily enough a mere 2 days after yours truly was born. Tool Gay Flutist.
On July 16, 2001, on a website that is the visual epitome of what old school internet used to look like, one can find a question and answers page directed at the band Tool, who were answering questions regarding their albums, specifically their most recent release of Lateralis, and general tidbits about the band. The interview really begins only in section C of the website, where the interviewer asks the band questions about their current lineup and coming into being story. But the interview quickly goes into more interesting topics, such as the band's formation being inspired by the science of lacrimology, which is a form of crying-induced therapy. But then the interview goes completely off the rails with a set of questions, including but not limited to: does one of the band members have AIDS? Does Maynard keep corpses in his basement? Are the band members cannibals, and do they sacrifice kids for their blood? And does Maynard actually have breasts? All of these questions were never confirmed nor denied. The interview then goes back to relative normality, but not before question C13, where the interviewer asked if any of the band members were gay, to which the band replied with, "Only the flutist." I don't want to be the one to spoil the joke here, but just so we're all on the same page, Tool never had a flutist in their ranks. God, I sound so lame for explaining that. Cardiac's RES main riff. It is hard to pinpoint what might be Cardiac's most popular song that they have ever released, as at the end of the day they are still a pretty obscure band. Their discography release was always done in non-conforming and orderly fashion, which makes tracking sales and such rather difficult. Despite it all, I feel that it is safe to assume that their song RES, originally from their cassette album The Seaside, might be their most beloved singular song to date. RES is perhaps the most catchy and replayable avant-rock song that I know of, and its midsection is one that should be taught in music classes everywhere, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. This entry actually references the main riff featured in every bar of the song's verses, which is fairly straightforward and has a jolly carousel aesthetic too, but in actuality this repeating riff was directly inspired by the Residents' song Act of Being Polite. And this is very much in line with the artistic and conceptual inspiration that Tim Smith and Cardiacs took from the Residents and implemented in their own works. This correlation also helps explain the name RES, which is not an acronym as it seems to be, but rather the beginning of the word residence. Zappa became an underground hero in communist Czechoslovakia. Václav Havel was born on October 5, 1936 in Prague in the then Czechoslovakia. Václav was born to the celebrated Havel family and was expected to become an entrepreneur like the rest of his forefathers. Havel's first major interest in life was the art of theater, and he began acting and writing his own plays in the early 60s after finishing his military service in 1959. Havel wrote and brought to life his first play called The Garden Party in 1963, and later outdid himself with his 1965 play The Memorandum, which has been invited to perform in New York in 1968. This collaboration between Czechoslovakia with the Allied West was a signifier of the liberation reforms that were taking place in Czechoslovakia in the late 60s. But all of Havel's work was halted when in 1968 the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia happened, where the Soviet Union, the Polish People's Republic, the People's Republic of Bulgaria, and the Hungarian People's Republic invaded Czechoslovakia and morphed the country under the authoritarian rule of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. That was a mouthful. Havel on his part was an open opposer of the Communist Party and worked against the Warsaw Pact, which ultimately led to his plays becoming forbidden in his own country, while some of them were still playing in stages in New York. This led Havel to pursue a political career, where he was a stark and long-running opposer of communist Czechoslovakia. During his time in opposition, Havel was introduced to Frank Zappa's music, which he described as being highly influential on the underground resistance of the Czech youth at the time, alongside the Velvet Underground and the Czech the Plastic People of the Universe. There was also heavy censorship and outright banning of Frank Zappa's music in Czechoslovakia at the time, but that did not disable people's ability to smuggle Zappa records into the country, and in the following 2 decades during the 70s and the 80s, Frank Zappa became somewhat of an underground hero in the communist nation. In 1989, Havel would be the first democratically elected president of Czechoslovakia, and he would serve as its president until its disintegration in 1993 alongside Communist Russia, and he was then re-elected as president of the reformed Czech Republic and served as president until 2003. And back in 1990, Havel, who was very familiar with Zappa's music, invited the latter to perform in Czechoslovakia and named him as Special Ambassador to the West on Trade, Culture and Tourism. And while this title might sound outrageous to some, Zappa did befriend Havel and advise him on options to grow tourism in Czechoslovakia and introduced him to the idea of incorporating credit cards into their economy. Zappa would go on to perform in Prague in 1991, which would be one of his final live performances ever, and after his passing in 1993, his 2 sons Amit and Weasel Zappa would organize the Tour de France concert tour in Europe and the Czech Republic as an honorary remembrance of their father's role in the decommunization of Czechoslovakia. Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 2 ripped on a 70s softcore porno. In 1967, French-Thai writer Mariat Rolet Adrian, who went by the pen name of Emmanuel Arsan, wrote an erotic novel titled Emmanuel, which details the sexual exploration journey of a 19-year-old Emmanuel who goes to Bangkok and then has a series of self-revealing sexual encounters there. The book was a success in France, and thus director Jas Jacquin approached Arsan with the intention to create a softcore pornography film based on her novel, to which he received the green light. The film Emmanuel was shot on location both in France and Thailand between 1973 and 1974, and the film was released in France to relatively negative critic reviews, but despite them, it managed to attain a staggering performance in the cinemas, and it is estimated to have reached an audience of over 300 million people. Though oddly enough, when it came to the film's soundtrack, its composer Pierre Bachelet claimed to have worked on it for 6 months before its release, but finished only a week after King Crimson released their album Lark's Tongues in Aspic. It was when King Crimson bassist John Wheaton went to see the film in theater and realized that something about the music sounded awfully familiar to him, so we went back to tell Robert Fripp that the film plagiarized their recent track Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 2. With a tape recorder in hand, Fripp went to see the film in the cinema himself and recorded the whole ordeal. He would later state that every sex scene in the film had his song playing in the background, though I went and watched some of the movie and I must admit that this is an overstatement. There are scenes where the unmistakable bombastic and distorted Larks is playing, but it is not present in most scenes. Nevertheless, this was an act of artistic theft, and so Fripp sued the filmmakers and won, which earned him a pitiful amount of money from reshowings of Emmanuel in theaters. But it was the right act to do, nonetheless. Progressive rock does not exist. This tier perhaps is a meme, but I feel as if there is some merit to the claim that progressive rock doesn't actually exist, so let's look into it. Progressive rock is inevitably a denomination of rock music, and to try and pinpoint the exact distinction of prog from regular rock music would result in answers such like longer song lengths, more proficient playing, concept albums, and a fusion of musical styles, all brought together under the wide umbrella of rock music. Yet, it seems that this attempt to define progressive rock would yield once you realize that bands like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and others would also perfectly fit the category here. Yet, those are generally not regarded as progressive rock bands, and it has been a long-standing tradition of fans of the genre to claim their disdain with the term prog, and and rather classify the various bands of the genre into art rock, classical rock, or avant rock. And in fact, in the early days of the genre, and even during its heyday in the 70s, the commonly accepted term for bands like Yes, Genesis, and even King Crimson was progressive pop, which would only retroactively be morphed into the familiar progressive rock classification. Pair this with the repeated insistence of creators such as King Crimson's Robert Fripp or Jethro Tull and Anderson, who deny their band's categorization as prog, alongside the long debate over Pink Floyd and its progressive status, and it will all lead you to at least reconsider the arbitrary definition of prog. Does it actually exist, or is it just a made-up construction taken too far by the fan base? Now obviously I oppose any notion that prog isn't real. Many bands and artists have downright identified themselves as prog heads and creators of the genre, and much like any other musical genre, the borders of progressive rock are hazy and malleable, but that does not mean that at its core prog is not a distinctive being from all other forms of rock music, and much like anything else in the world of humans, prog and rock and music are all just shared constructions of man, and if we choose to believe that they exist, that facilitates their actuality. As long as there are people to love this genre, prog will continue to exist in all its glory. Yeah, I think we can call this a wrap. So, thank you everyone. I want to thank specifically my lovely supporters over on Patreon, being Clay Walnham and Wrist of Kings, who have supported me for so long now and really motivated me to come back. And I also would like to mention Upsilon Nova and Lindsay Haycox, who have supported me for a long time during my hiatus. In addition, I would like to say a big thank you to Raya Meir, who composed the background music for this video and made it specifically progressive as per my request. It has been such an asset for the success of a video like this. Next up, I want to say thank you to Electric Lazarus over on Reddit for making the original iceberg that inspired me to finally make this video. And last but not least, I want to thank you all, the viewers, for actually joining me on this wonderful adventure. And I would like to say this: if you really did enjoy this video, please give it a like. It will be the most accurate metric that I can have as to how much you enjoyed this video, if at all. So yeah, that's about it guys. This has been the Progressive Rock Iceberg Explained, and I'll see you all next time.